Thinking About Sexuality, 25 of January 2025. The last generation is unprogressive to the point of being illogical, and my generation is progressive to the point of being illogical. We are in a transition phase, where the new ideologies must be extreme in nature to break the momentum of the old ideologies, before we will, hopefully in the near future, reach a homeostasis whose ground between the two has more of a logic. Similarly, perhaps to how Dadaism had to be extreme to finish fully deconstructing academic painting, and thus would make no sense in the contexts of its past or future times. Unfortunately for it happens that I live in this time of transition, and thus am not left with the well-chewed opinions of the matter, and must shape my own, fighting against all the inevitable biases of my own mind. It will be said, however, that I have nothing to gain or lose in this matter. I am a heterosexual cisgendered boy, and the point of this writing is to be an exercise in reasoning, and an opportunity to locate my own biases and prejudices, and work through them, eliminating the opinions that end up illogical, and continuing to consider those that are not. With this said, I would like to begin this exercise with a comment I left online a few days ago. 18th of January 2025. I watch a lot of femboy and LGBT content, but with transfem content, I always have a voice in the back of my mind saying, is putting on makeup female? Are dresses female? Is long hair female? And ultimately, the answer is always no, never inherently. It is every single time a social construct. But if that is the case, does transsexuality make any sense at all if what you are claiming is an aesthetic tied to a gender rather than a gender? If you want to choose your own pronouns, then great, but ultimately, we're giving the bodies we're given, and it's best to accept it than to want to pretend it's something else. I don't know, stuff I think about. 25th of January 2025. I'm choosing this comment as a jumping point to begin these considerations, as I have already located flaws in its logic that I can now elaborate on. Thus will be the point of writing down my thoughts on the matters of sexuality, rather than keeping them in rumination in my mind. I want to actually find what I may be right and wrong on. There are two opinions implied in this comment that I want to make evolve. The first is the lack of consideration of the real effects of dysphoria in transsexual people, and the second is the shift of my complaint in the matter from transsexuality to the larger notion of gender. In fact, in this comment, I have considered the sociological desires of transsexuality without considering the physiological one, the notion of dysphoria. And here we find the first active bias of my mind that I have to fight against, for in my mind I have always considered that feeling content with your body is a luxury reserved to the few, and not one freely granted to all. No obese person wants to be obese, no ugly person wants to be ugly. But this consideration I will fight back against, because overweight people can and should exercise to better their appearance and health, and ugly people can work to better their appearance if that grants them contentment. Thus we can, obviously, extend this reasoning to sexuality. HRT and operations are in this day real solutions, and I will no longer deny dysphoria to be a real problem. I do, however, believe it to be best to accept whatever physical flaws cannot be changed, or whose dysphoric person does not have the finances to change, for suffering about problems outside of our control does not allow for any contentment to be found. It is best to follow stoicism. So that is for dysphoria, but is it a sufficient argument for the concept of gender as being separate from physical sexuality? Let's explore this. The consensus that the contemporary popular opinion has fallen upon is the idea that gender is separate from sex. Thus, a transsexual person can consider themselves of the gender opposite to their physical sex even without biological changes, such as HRT or operations, that would change that physical sex. But obviously, this begs the question, what is gender? The answer is that it is not physical, it is sociological. It is a matter of aesthetic and behavior. The first thing that this implies is that consequentially dysphoria has no weight in this matter, as dysphoria is purely physical. It is in no way sociological. But by the extension of this reasoning, dysphoria has no part to play in the establishing of gender, since gender is a way to dress, a way to act, and not the natural shape of the body. But perhaps this reasoning I will later have to go back upon, for dysphoria in the shape of the growth of hair or breast or whatever else does play a part in aesthetic, which as we have seen is a matter of gender. In any case, the popular opinion wants gender to be separate from sex, and it wants gender to be sociological. It is a behavior and an aesthetic. And so here we have it, the point at which I am in disagreement with the popular opinion. According to my understanding of the world, the aesthetic tied to masculinity and femininity is, as I have stated in the comment, purely artificial. It is not just a human construct, it is a human construct specific to the Western civilization, which goes to show just how artificial it truly is. Behavior is a much more complicated matter, and perhaps the matter with which I have struggled the most. Here is my bias. I consider that behavioral differences between males and females are purely social constructs. I do not observe differences in behavior between my friends who are girls and my friends who are boys, and I myself believe that my own behavior would be the exact same if I were a girl. The problem with this bias is that it seems to be at least partly untrue. My current understanding of the matter is that behavior tied to sexuality is in fact very largely taught, born from social pressure to conform, but that it is also at least partly inherent or natural. By this logic, the separation of gender and sex has a reasoning, for one can choose their gender depending on the behavioral pattern they were born with instead of their physical sex. The problem with this is that it appears that this natural behavioral component is extremely inferior to the taught one. I would be tempted to guess the division to be 90% taught behavior and 10% natural behavior, but I am no psychologist. If these numbers were somewhat true, however, is 10% of behavioral inclination really enough to justify the distinction between sex and gender? Because here comes the big part. I believe this distinction to be more harmful than it is helpful. Such a minor behavioral component simply does not seem enough of an argument. The concept of gender as separate from sex reinforces the social stereotypes of gender. It reinforces the idea that this is how a boy should look like and behave, and this is what a girl should look like and behave. The notion of gender distinct from sex is extremely counter-progressive. The very thing that transsexuals are fighting for, the distinction of gender from sex, is the thing that is making them suffer. Gender-oriented social pressures and expectations. To abolish gender rules would solve the problem, and yet transsexuals are augmenting or maintaining gender rules by associating them to gender. Here's my opinion and my current understanding on the matter. If we abolish the concept of gender and understand sexuality as a purely physical thing, then gender rules would be gone with it. A transsexual person would not have to care about what their sex is, as it would have no role to their place in society. But if they feel dysphoria and have the funds to solve it, they can do HRT and/or operations, and by those standards, their physical sexuality will in fact be changed. But this time, its only function would in fact be to solve dysphoria only, and not gender-related social constructs, as those constructs would no longer exist anyway. Because in fact, this brings me back to the second point of my initial comment that I wanted to make evolve. It is not transsexuality that I am now choosing to blame, it is gender. This is my current understanding and opinions of the matter. The distinction of sex and gender is counter-progressive. I will be rereading these writings to see what deserves more consideration and reevaluation. 26th of January 2025. I'm very glad that I am putting down these thoughts on paper. I find that when one keeps one's thoughts in their mind, they become their opinions instead of the presentator of them. You tend to more easily lose track of the lines of reasoning that brought you to your conclusions and become the opinion, have more difficulty seeing flaws in the mental tracks you followed. But if those tracks are written down, you can retrace your steps at any point and find bumps in the road, or entire deviations that you had initially missed. I believe that I now have enough material to express and maintain a singular opinion, that gender distinct from sex is counter-progressive. I will allow myself to hold it until sufficient arguments are given to break it down. By counter-progressive, I do not mean unaligned with the popular opinion. I mean that it maintains old ideologies that society would be better without. But now, at this point in reasoning, I must ask myself, if I consider gender to be the problem, does that mean that I consider transsexuality to be counter-progressive? The answer is no, and I will elaborate. In yesterday's writings, I have blended transsexual and transgender as a singular concept, but thankfully for my line of reasoning, the popular opinion has made the distinction between the two. Transsexual is a matter of the body, transgender is a matter of sociality. Transsexuality I find progressive, as the matter of sexuality remains in the order of the biological. If a person does hormone replacement therapy and considers it enough to consider themselves of the opposite sex, I will agree, since the physiological barrier has now been traversed and the boundaries blurred. Transgender, however, is a matter of gender and of the social rules attached to it that it chooses to perpetuate. It considers that gender is an aesthetic and a behavior, and as I have formulated in yesterday's writings, the aesthetic is purely a social construct, and the difference in behavior between males and females is not only extremely minimal, it is also largely born from social conditioning. This is my understanding of the matter at the moment. 28th of January 2025. The idea of gender poses that a person must be considered in a social context depending on how they feel physically and mentally. I pose that physicality must play no part in how we consider a person. I am pro-transsexual and anti-transgender, for I understand gender as the problem. If the person feels dysphoric, it is a matter of the body, not of social behavior, and HRT operations, lasers, and whatever else will help, but it is a matter of the relation between a person and their body, and does not play into social considerations. As for the mental component of gender, I have already stated that, for one, the difference in behavior between males and females is very faint, and for two, it is more so born from social conditioning than from biological realities. But let's test this understanding by considering that a misfit behavioral component is enough to justify the categorization that is gender. What if males and females truly were fundamentally different on a behavioral level? That would surely justify the being of transgender, for one could fit into a gender appropriate to their behavior. I contest this, and I pose that for three, even if males and females are fundamentally behaviorally different, we should still consider them in the same way on a social level. Males and females should be treated the same in society. Women have fought so hard to earn the same place as men in society, and now the idea of gender as distinct from sex is growing, and since it is a matter of the social and not of the physical, it is posing that males and females should be treated, understood, and considered in a different way to each other. The work of feminism is unfortunately being dismantled. That is only as long as we maintain the idea of gender. Even if these differences in behavior are distinct, we must, for the betterment of society, consider them the same in social environments, just as we must treat people of any ethnics, cultures, neurotypes, and anything else the same, even if differences in behavior come with these characteristics. We would not treat a dark-skinned person differently than a white-skinned person, even if they have very real cultural and social components specific to that ethnicity. And in the same manner, we must not treat females and males differently, even if they have differences in behavior and understanding. Thus, if gender is behavioral, it must still not affect how a person is considered, which of course defeats the purpose of gender, as its purpose is to be seen and considered in a specific manner. Now that I have discovered that my opinion lays in the abolition of gender, let's put this perspective to the test by considering a situation. What if a person born male wants to be seen a female, and adopts the female aesthetic but does not do HRT or operations? To the eyes of the popular opinion, that person's sex is male and their gender is female. So surely the abolition of gender would only hurt such a person. That is a very valid argument, and to it I have this to respond. Let's observe this on the physical and on the social. On the physical, if that person feels dysphoric, the problem does not lay in how they are seen, but how they feel within their bodies. And so HRT and/or operations will be the thing to solve this, which will in addition be of a sufficient argument to call themselves of the female sex. But what if that person does not feel dysphoric and only cares about the social component of femininity? In that case, we move on to the social component of this matter, and I say of this person, they are perpetuating gender roles. The fact that females have a specific aesthetic that is forbidden to males due to social expectations is specifically the problem, and they are playing into it instead of against it. They are connoting that because they are of that gender, they have access to that aesthetic, or that because they are expressing that aesthetic, they are of that gender. They are enforcing the idea that dresses, makeup, specific colors, and other components are female. They are perpetuating gender roles. If we dismantle gender roles and allowed all aesthetics and behaviors to both sexes, we would not need to be transgender, for one would not need justification for having adopted the aesthetic and/or behavior of a specific gender. If the person born male of this situation wants to be seen as female, without the biological components to make of that a truth, they are inexorably implying that females must be treated differently than males in social contexts, and this I am against. They're implying that there is a female way to dress, to behave, to be seen, to be considered, to be acted with. These distinctions are gender rules. They are counterprogressive. Transgender is counterprogressive. Pansexual, as opposed to bisexual, who only considers physical sex, is counterprogressive. Non-binary is counterprogressive. Gender fluid is counterprogressive. All of these connote gender and thus gender rules. It seems that through this exercise I have accidentally stumbled onto an opinion. From today on, I consider myself as being for the abolition of gender until I am given sufficient arguments to change or nuance this opinion, if such a day comes. As I have expressed, I have nothing to gain or lose in these ponderings, and I want myself to always be open to re-examining and changing my opinions. February 1st, 2025. Sexuality in this day is a complicated and nuanced matter. With IPLs, HRT, and surgery, we have become capable of blurring the line between male and female, just as contemporary art had blurred the line between what is art and what is not. And so the response to this was not to eliminate the social aspect of gender, but to place it in the choosing of each and every person. With physical sex no longer being a clear-cut indicator of gender, gender had become separate from sex. But then, what is gender? Is it an aesthetic, a behavior, or just a word? Has a masculine birded man just as much right calling himself a woman than anyone else? Although the popular opinion doesn't quite understand why, its answer tends to be no, because the popular opinion isn't as progressive as it wants to be, or at least the logic in its attempt to be so is flawed, for it still associates to masculinity and femininity traits of aesthetic and behavior. Although I do not agree with the popular opinion, I will choose to respect their opinion, for now it has become a matter of opinion rather than absolute truths. We are attempting to choose what is the best course for the present and future social realities of humans. The last generation has left us with a world of clearly divided genders, and the popular opinion solution is to allow the choosing of gender to individuals. My perspective is that this is only a temporary solution, and that on the long term we should strive to abolish gender and its rules. I cannot blame transgender women for feeling the need to call themselves women, to wear the female-attributed aesthetic and behavior, and to be perceived in that category of humans, because the current reality they live in is one of clearly divided genders. It is the necessary temporary solution. And my opinion is that the long-term solution is to extend the female-male division from the physical up to the social. The counter-argument I still have to this is still the matter of behavior. The aesthetic I understand is completely artificial, but the behavior is only partly so, and how much exactly is what I struggle to understand. Perhaps there truly is a strong difference in behavior between genders that is not just a result of social conditioning. After all, strong divisions between genders are established in about every country on Earth and have existed, as I understand it, since as far back as the Mesolithic. This is the reason for which I accept the perspective of the popular opinion. However, my decision remains to contest it, for I have a counter-argument. I believe that gender-specific behavior should not be a factor in how a person is considered in a social situation. In an academic debate, the gender of an expert presenting an opinion should have no impact in our matter of receiving the opinion. In a social situation, the gender of a person should not alternate how we behave towards that person or how we consider them, just as we should alternate perspective and considerations depending on a person's ethnicity and culture. This is the theory, however, and there is a bias I am subjected to that I must analyze. I am autistic, and like the majority of high-functioning people with autism, my behavioral gender filter is very light. It does not affect much my own behavior. It has been shown that many people with autism label themselves as non-binary, which I am opposed to, for I am for the abolishment of gender. But the perspective makes a lot of sense. To be a human male or a human female, one must first be a human. This is a difficult bias to deal with, for I naturally tend to suppose that all gender behaviors are the result of social construct, when that is mostly untrue. So the question remains, is behavior enough to justify male-female divisions? Is behavior enough to justify gender? And because the answer to this is not an absolute truth, it must be that it is a matter of opinion. My opinion is tangled with my biases, but I have sufficiently dissected it to decide to withhold it. And for it is an opinion, I will tolerate and emphasize with the popular opinion, even though my perspective shows it to be negative for humanity on the long term. 6th of February 2025. Today I have been told something that is making me completely reevaluate my perspective. Some people see a difference between gender and gender expression. I had not considered this. If this perspective is logical, it is then gender expression I am against. But in this context, what exactly is gender as detached from the expression of it? It would be behavior, and this line of reasoning would also allow for the physical to be part of gender, dysphoria being the indicator and the misfit of it. But what even is behavioral gender if detached from gender expression? Is the way you act even when alone enough for the categorization that is gender? I certainly understand the logic in this, but I also want to contest it by saying what even is the point of categorization at this point? This is a nuanced matter, and it must be considered as such. But if I had to land on an opinion at this point in reasoning, I would still be for the abolition of gender. If gender is not social, then this suggests that a given person would feel like a boy or feel like a girl. I do not think there are such feelings, and by that I mean that I only understand them as social. But maybe I am wrong. Do boys and girls think differently? Is that enough for categorization? What is the point of categorizing genders if gender roles don't exist anymore? Why would anyone care about their gender? Why would it matter? It must be social, right? If it's not about being socially perceived in a specific matter, what is the point of making a male-female distinction at all? I was so convinced about my opinion a few days ago, but now I'm just confused. Probably gender does exist, and it can be distinct from sex, and gender expression is what had been tangling these matters into a mess. But yet again, if gender is not about being perceived in a specific manner, what is the point of it existing? When you are alone, you are no longer an actor. You just become an observer. You remove yourself from any possible categorization. Or do you? Is the way you act and behave really enough for the arbitrary word of male or female to be labeled upon you? What is the point of any of this? Gender only has validity when it is not social, and gender has no function when it is not social. Alright, let's try to take something out of this. I am going to have to sever the nuance of this matter if I want to uphold a singular opinion. Here is my opinion at this point in reasoning. I consider gender to be social, because if it is not, I see no reason why it would exist. And if thus it is social, I remain, as always, for the abolition of it. 7th of February 2025. Essentially, this dilemma can be set to a single question. Is behavior enough to justify gender? And this question is complicated because it is not a matter of absolute truths. It is a matter of choosing how we want to consider something. I don't think one feels like a boy or feels like a girl unless they are seen. As I understand it, gender is purely a social tool. And if it is, it must be abolished, for it is needlessly reinforcing gender expectations. My opinion rests in the fact that I do not perceive a difference between gender and gender expression. If this perception changes, my opinion will have to change with it. The distinction between gender and gender expression is a very good argument, and it has troubled me greatly because I had not considered it. I had always understood gender as being purely social. Let's ponder upon this division. It suggests that gender expression is the social component, and gender is a purely interior component. This is making me re-question my whole understanding. If a person was stuck on a desert island with no social context to exist in, they would therefore still be of their gender, even without the expression of it. Except, would they? I thought about it this way. Would I still be autistic if I were stuck on a desert island? And the immediate first answer was yes, it is a part of the very person I am. Except on further analysis, I concluded that actually no, I would not be, for autism is a specific difference to other humans. If all humans were autistic, no one would be. Is a doctor still a doctor if they are stuck on a desert island? I would suppose not, as that is a specific function that only operates in a social structure. And so, would you still be of a specific gender if stuck on a desert island? It is a trait that only has meaning when contrasted to different traits, just like being autistic or being a doctor. And so, if it only exists when it can be contrasted with others, if there are no others to contrast with, it cannot exist. That is just a perspective, however, and it does have flaws. If we assume the distinction between sex, gender expression, and gender, then we can consider that sex is binary, gender expression is non-binary, and gender is binary. Except if gender is binary, then we are considering that there is, on both ends of the spectrum, an ultimately male way to behave and an ultimately female way to behave. Are these behaviors truths? They are at least partly born from social conditioning, but what about the aspects of them that are not? I know that testosterone, for instance, has the characteristic of making their withholders angry and impulsive. But wouldn't a man still be a man if they did not have testosterone? Would they not be? If it can be removed, because it can, doesn't that mean that gender is distinct from hormones? I guess what troubles me the most in all of this is the fact that the male and female way to act just seems so arbitrary to me. I have a lot of trouble understanding them as truths. And if they are not truths, then there is no point in stitching them to a gender. 8th of February 2025. Today I am thinking that behavior is not enough to justify gender. If it was, we would have to assume that there is an objectively masculine way to behave and an objectively feminine way to behave on the extreme sides of the spectrum of gender. I do not believe such things exist. I think behavior can only be subjectively attached to gender. And if this were the case, this would also mean that there is actually no difference between gender and gender expression. Popular culture has constructed in us the idea of what masculinity looks like and what femininity looks like, and it told us that in these genders are behaviors that are inherent to us. I disagree. If I cannot say that boys and girls truly behave exactly the same, I can't say that there is no such thing as an objectively male behavior and an objectively female behavior. The reality is much too vague and unprecise for the justification of gender. There are some behaviors that are tied to hormones. Testosterone makes many angry and impulsive. But gender wants itself to be of the psyche. It wants itself beyond hormones and unchanging in spite of what hormones the body withholds. Gender subjects objectivity in male and female behavior beyond hormonal behavior, and I do not believe such things exist. Maintaining the concept of gender is so much more detrimental than it is helpful. It perpetuates the idea that the two sexes should have their own specific aesthetic, behavior, and rules that are essentially forbidden to the other. I cannot agree with such a concept. Today I understand gender and gender expression as one and the same, and thus I am opposed to both. 11th of February 2025. Today I would like to talk about something I had not touched upon until now because I thought it too obvious to address, and this is that the matter of sexual attraction is a matter of the physical and psychological, and not of the social. As I understand it, this is not a matter of opinion, it truly seems like a matter of truth. Here's the dilemma. A large amount of the popular opinion, I would say the majority of them, believe that if a male were in a voluntary romantic relationship with another male or a female with a female, they would automatically be considered homosexual, regardless of their true physical sexual attraction. I understand this as fundamentally untrue. If a gay male were in a relationship with a female, say because his family forces him to, or because he is ashamed of being gay, this would not change the fact that this individual is gay. Sexual attraction cannot be changed. If you are heterosexual, you will be your whole life. If you are homosexual, you will be your whole life. If you are bisexual, you will be your whole life. Sexual attraction is, before anything else, essentially what hormones your body is attracted to. I, for example, am heterosexual. My body is attracted to the female skin texture and the female smell, and slightly repulsed by the male skin texture and the male smell. If I were to have a boyfriend for reasons of my choosing, these physical traits would not change. I would still be heterosexual. Yet popular culture still has a lot of difficulty conceiving this. Popular culture beloves homosexuality, and understandably so. It was a martyrized social reality that has always existed and has long been repressed, only now being socially accepted and beloved to compensate, and beloved for its uniqueness much needed in society. And so individuals may be quick to call themselves gay if, for example, a male is attracted to female-presenting males, such as femboys. Yet, unless it is a physical truth, they are not so. To illustrate this point, I will refer to the ancient Greek, and in a lesser part Roman, practice of pederasty. Now, pederasty is absolutely not something we should celebrate, for although it does show admiration and understanding for homosexuality that would later be repressed by the coming of Christianity, it is a matter of a romantic and sexual relationship between an adult and a teenager, which we thankfully now understand as problematic. However, this practice does give us a clear understanding of how homosexual relationships were seen in antiquity, and it tells us that to the Greeks, one does not need to be gay to be attracted to males that had not yet went through puberty. And it's not like pederasty was restricted to specific individuals. Anyone could form a pederastic relation, which in turn would mean that, according to the popular opinion's understanding of sexual attraction as a social matter, 100% of the ancients would have been homosexual. Obviously, this is not correct. The comparison between how homosexuality was seen in antiquity and how it is now is very interesting to analyze. In antiquity, noticeably in Greece and Rome, they essentially did not know that homosexuality existed, and that individuals could be exclusively attracted to the same sex as them. Yet they did understand that one does not need to be gay to be attracted to individuals of the same sex. And as for today, we understand that homosexuality exists, and we have forgotten that it is not a necessity to be interesting romantically and or sexually to individuals of the same sex. The understanding in antiquity is so different to ours. I have learned, for I study archaeology and I have studied history, that the ancient Greeks and Romans essentially understood relations, sexual and romantic, with other males to be relations of fun. It was seen as juvenile and lighthearted, as opposed to the later necessary relation with a female, a necessity to have children that will care for you in old age. The Iliad is our ideal illustrator to this point. Achilles' relation with Patroclus is one of pleasure, fun, and true love, and his relation with Briseis is one of necessity. The last angle to these matters of sexual attraction I would like to address in today's writings is the fact that many in the popular opinion consider that sexual attraction is determined by what gender one is attracted to, as opposed to what sex. Again, and obviously, I understand this as fundamentally untrue. Sexual attraction can be observed in its most basic form to what hormones one is attracted to, what body smell and skin texture, among other things, one will be physically attracted to. The gender of an individual and their partners cannot alternate this physical reality, just as conversion therapy cannot convert. Sexual attraction is unchanging. If a male is attracted to an individual that is male in gender, female in sex, and does not do hormone replacement, this first male cannot be considered gay, for sexual attraction is, unlike the artificial concept of gender, completely non-social. It is physical and psychological. 13th of February 2025. There is a flaw I have observed in my previous perspective. I have been systematically removing physicality from the notion of gender because I understood gender as to be purely social. But if there is a difference between gender and gender expression, this is something I would be wrong about. Dysphoria would thus be a valid indicator of misfit gender to sex, and gender distinct from sex would thus be valid. Under this perspective, I'm currently feeling like the notion of gender as applied to oneself in a non-social context would be perfectly fine. But if we apply gender in social situations, we are creating an immense and probably inevitable risk of in fact perpetuating gender rules. This is how I understand it now. In an ideal society where gender expression was understood as arbitrary, this problem would not exist, and yet it does. Or perhaps I'm just trying to maintain my initial opinion in spite of logical proof against it. And yet again, are there objectively male and female behaviors? Are there objectively male and female ways to feel within your body? This too appears vague and arbitrary to me. I seem to have successfully cultivated in myself the two opposing opinions. One part of me sees no difference between gender and gender expression. It wants to express, of course you're gender fluid, everyone is gender fluid, because gender does not exist. Why do you feel the need to call yourself a woman to dress and act like one? Why must you enforce gender rules so, and how dare you call yourself progressist? What do you mean you feel like a boy? What do you think it means to be a boy? That's just a physical vessel. This part of me feels great frustration towards the popular opinion, and it is counterbalanced by the opposite opinion that I have managed to construct. This part sees gender and gender expression as separate, and thus gender as a valid concept. It recognizes that neurotypical males and females have different inherent behaviors, and thus dysphoria and a misattributed gender to sex behavior can be solved by the understanding of gender distinct from sex. The two perspectives are flawed in separate ways. Gender abolition is flawed in that it presumes that behaviors are non-gendered, which is apparently largely untrue. And gender acceptance is flawed in that it suggests a systematic gender-to-behavior classification, when in truth, gendered behavior is very faint and very arbitrary. It is also flawed in that gender and gender expression are very closely linked, and thus any acceptance of gender enforces gender rules, at least in this day and age. And finally, it is flawed in that it generally proposes that genders must be considered, seen, understood, and interacted with differently in accordance to the gender, and this I am irreversibly opposed to. This seems to be somewhat of a conclusion to this exercise. Probably the most important thing I have learned is that gender abolition is an opinion and not a truth, and it is not exempt of flaw. Yet as we have seen, maintaining the idea of gender does seem a lot more flawed. February 23rd, 2025. You cannot be attracted to a gender. It is not possible. Romantic attraction is about behavior, and behavior is only arbitrarily and artificially attached to gender. There is no objective male or female way to act. Sexual attraction is a matter of the body. It is dictated by body shape, hair, genitals, and far above all else, hormones. The hormones you are attracted to is what dictates your sexual attraction. The skin texture and body smell your body is programmed to find appealing. What I am meaning to say by all of this is that the concept of pansexual is devoid of sense. I have understood two ways of seeing the distinction between bisexual and pansexual. The first says that bisexual is a matter of the body, and pansexual a matter of gender. The second considers that both refer to gender. It considers a range of genders between male and female, and sees bisexual as being attracted to the entire range, and pansexual as having certain stopping points when it comes to attraction. By this understanding, we can conclude that pansexual is completely demune of logic, because one either is attracted to a hormone or isn't. You cannot be attracted to a gender. Gender is an aesthetic. It is not a behavior, for the non-social conditioned behavior between males and females is extremely faint and variable. And if it was to be a behavior, by choosing this definition, we are inexorably stating that an artificial and arbitrary social conditioned behavior should be superposed onto male and female, and that both should be considered differently to each other. This is gender roles. This is what we were striving to abolish before gender became something to choose. Thus, gender is an aesthetic. Not only does this too reinforce gender roles, but also can play no part in romantic or sexual attraction. Everyone is pansexual, and this is because no one is. Similarly to how everyone is gender fluid because no one is. Because male-female aesthetics and behavior are constructs that we fail to see as such. Pansexual considers that if you are in the possibility of being attracted to the same gender, you will be pansexual. And this is arbitrary because gender, as detached from sex, is a social construct. In a day like ours, where hormone replacement therapy is an option, any straight male can be attracted to a trans girl doing HRT or a femboy doing HRT, because the hormone is what dictates attraction. Neither of these can change their sexual attraction, for sexual attraction is unchanging, and it is not defined by behavior and aesthetic, but by the hormones only. But even outside of the exceptional case of HRT, any straight boy has in him the possibility of being attracted to a female-presenting male, and vice versa. Ancient Greece and Rome have demonstrated this. Pansexual can make sense, however, if we remove from it the concept of gender and replace the spectrum of female-male gender with a spectrum of estrogen to testosterone. For some people who are biologically bisexual can be more attracted to one than to the other, and under this definition, pansexual has a logic and a use for purpose to be used. But most people in the popular opinion consider that attraction is to gender rather than physicality, and are thus removing the logic in the word pansexual. I have stated that romantic attraction is about behavior, and by this I do not mean gendered behavior, for females and males act essentially the same as each other. Aesthetic tied to gender being completely artificial, pansexual as an attraction to gender and not sex, would consider that attraction correlates with a gendered behavior, and thus fails to understand that behavior is mostly not gendered. Females and males essentially act and think the same, so behavior cannot impact core attraction. 5th of March, 2025. An important question we should ask ourselves would be the following. Is romantic attraction enough to qualify whether an individual is gay or straight? We use the word sexual orientation for this last, but let's assume that the wording is wrong. Sexual attraction is certainly a clear-cut indicator for whether one is straight or gay. The hormones one is attracted to would dictate it all. But in this day and age, the popular opinion tends to consider that an individual would be gay even if they were not attracted in a hormonal manner. Thus it must be that to them, romantic attraction is a valid indicator of sexual orientation. Although the matter is nuanced, I disagree with this perspective far more than I agree with it. Here is my reason. If we consider that romantic attraction can dictate sexuality, we are implying male and female behavioral differences that, although do exist, are in truth very faint and moldable. It implies that one would be attracted to either a male behavior or a female behavior, or somewhere between the two, while forgetting that sexuality is not a straightforward indicator of behavior, since gender does not exist, while forgetting that a straight girl can have a very masculine behavior and a straight guy a very feminine behavior, since both of these are very arbitrary and fluctuant. For these reasons, I consider that sexual attraction is an indicator of sexual orientation and not romantic attraction. Of course, as I said, this is a nuanced matter. There are in truth behavioral differences between males and females, and to consider them as indicator for sexuality is not completely illogical. But as I observe it, it still is less logical than to consider sexual attraction alone, for this last is far less arbitrary. Under this logic, I'm proposing that we adopt, I, a male, would still be straight even if I had a boyfriend. Having a boyfriend would not change my hormonal attraction, and romantic attraction would play no part in sexual orientation. Thus, by all logic, my sexuality would not be altered, because in fact, sexuality cannot be altered. Neither the progressive popular opinion of my generation nor the conservative opinions of the last are adopting this perspective, but as I hope to have demonstrated, it still is the one that is the most logical. And thus I come back to my initial point, that pansexual makes no sense, for it is mostly used to explain that one is in the possibility of being in a romantic intersexual relationship with an individual of the same sex, even if hormonal and/or romantic attraction do not correlate with the relationship. This makes no sense because everyone is disposed to this possibility. The ancient Greek and Roman cultures have demonstrated this, as they were not familiar with the concept of homosexuality and considered that any individual could take pleasure in a romantic or sexual relationship with one of the same sex. If I had a male companion, I would still be straight, for to my understanding, behavioral traits are too vague and arbitrary to correlate with gender attraction, and having a male companion would not alter my hormonal attraction. I suggest that the term pansexual should only be used to suggest, unlike bisexual, an inclination to one sex more than to the other, in a matter that is purely of the physical and not of the romantic. This is my understanding. And of course, I refuse the use of the word pansexual as a replacement to bisexual under the ideology that there are more than two genders. I have sufficiently argumented that there are no genders, that there are made-up constructs that are detrimental to society. 7th of March, 2025. Essentially, my arguments can be simplified into the following phrase. Being gay makes you want a same-sex partner, but having a same-sex partner doesn't inherently make you gay. The reason why my discontentment is axed towards the word pansexual is because it is currently often used in a lack of understanding of this concept. Everyone can be in a same-sex relation, but not everyone is gay. However, everyone is in fact pansexual, as the popular opinion uses the word to say, in the possibility of being in a same-sex relation, and thus of course the word has no meaning. Of course not everyone uses the word in this manner. Some seem to use it to say more attracted to one gender than to another, which is a great use for it, but others, however, use it as a replacement to bisexual under the ideology that there are more than two genders, and this I will oppose myself to even more, for although under certain perspectives, the notion of gender opposed to sex has validity, the truth is that considering a metaphysical difference between males and females will only enforce gender rules, which we must strive to abolish. Gender distinct from sex is of the mind only, and not of the body. Male-female differences on the physical are the matter of sex. One can consider that chromosomes are the surest indicator of sex, but I do argue that hormones and body parts, which unlike chromosomes can be altered by bodily modifications, are more than valid enough indicators for sex. After all biological categorization always carry some form of arbitrary trait judgment. And so if an individual does bodily modifications, it is, to my understanding, valid enough to say that their sex has been altered. But still, this is a matter of sex, which gender is distinct from. And by accepting gender as a concept, we're implying that there exist inherent male and female behaviors that I suggest are too vague and fluctuant to deserve classification. Male-female differences in behavior do exist, so the classification of gender is not completely abstract, but maintaining this classification perpetuates gender rules and suggests that males and females should be societally considered differently to one another. This is basically just sexism. This is an unequal understanding and perception and treatment of the two sexes. A logical counterargument would be the following. Since in this day and age sex can be altered and its barriers transgressed so easily, wouldn't it be logical for gender to remain in the order of choosing rather than the observation of physical traits? For example, a female can take testosterone to build up her muscle mass, and a male can do estrogen or simply take testosterone blockers alone to reduce the negative effects of it. These individuals have blurred the physical line of sex, and so to my arguments, their gender is to their choosing. But why not extend this choosing to all individuals, since everyone is disposed to make these bodily modifications? These people can choose where their sex lies, for the line has been blurred, but the concept of gender certainly would extend this freedom of choosing to all. And to this I reply that sex is an arbitrary trait, but gender implies intentful and artificial behaviors, or even more arbitrarily, aesthetics, that we simply should not be superposing on top of sex anymore. Female-male behavioral differences exist, but they are so vague, and although they are the justification for why transgender exists, they are not even the drive for it existing. The drive is to be seen under a specific aesthetic, and to be placed under a specific gender rule that feels more appropriate. It fucking is about gender rules, and no one dares to admit it. If gender rules and aesthetic differences vanished, which we should fight so that they do, transgender would make absolutely no sense anymore. Transsexual would, of course, for that is a matter of the body, and there will always be some unfortunate individuals to feel dysphoria. But transgender only concerns the artificial and societally hurtful concepts of gender, only defendable by the vague behavioral differences between males and females. Transgender people are reinforcing gender roles, even though gender roles are the reasons why they were suffering and had to become transgender. What a fucking mess. There is something that I need to briefly address, and that is the matter of opinion. Since female-male behavioral differences do exist, both the maintaining and the abolition of gender happen to fall into the matter of opinion rather than search for truth. And thus one might criticize my writings for imposing my opinion and not allowing others to maintain theirs. I will keep this in mind, and I will, of course, be open to opposing opinions. But I will also say that the matters of how we consider sexuality in society is no different to politics, in that although we accept that others have differing opinions, the goal of opposing parties still remains to place their ideal methodology on the whole of society, not just on themselves. It is true that by saying that genders should be abolished, I am invalidating individuals' perspectives, but the opposite is true as well. By saying that genders should exist, they are also imposing on all others a perspective that is neither inherently correct nor righteous. We have opposing opinions, and we should both be allowed to maintain them, but ultimately, the perspective chosen by the masses will accept one over the other, even though both are acceptable. I'm not forbidding you to have a differing opinion when I suggest abolition of gender. I am proposing my perspective and methodology that is to be practically placed into society, just as yours currently is. Both of our perspectives concern us all. A counterargument to this would be that acceptance of gender exists more so on an individual level, and the abolition of it is more so about everyone. The differing opinions might not be set upon the same plane. But I think that they mainly are, because by saying that your gender is not the same as your sex, you're inexorably implying that gender can in fact be distinct from sex. And this is an opinion that applies to all, just as mine does. 8th of March 2025. Pansexual does not mean anything. Bisexual means attracted to both genders, and pansexual means attracted regardless of gender. This can be translated in two ways. The first would be that both bisexual and pansexual have the same meaning. The second, and this is the way it is often used, would be to explain that the individual is disposed to being in a same-sex relationship, even if they are not gay or bisexual physiologically. If they were, they would be gay or bisexual, and so pansexual is used as a replacement in this case of non-physiological attraction. So in other words, the word pansexual is used because people are incapable of conceiving being in a same-sex relationship if the individual is straight, or rather suggest that being in a same-sex relationship automatically does not make you straight anymore. I do not agree. I disagree with pansexual for the same reason I disagree with gender, in that it gives more importance to the arbitrary societal and behavioral matters over physical realities. Pansexual is used to say that an individual is disposed to being in a same-sex relation, despite being straight. This would apply to everyone on Earth. Everyone is in the possibility of being in a same-sex relationship. Pansexual just means admitting it for yourself specifically. Gay, straight, and bisexual should not be defined by whether you are in the possibility of being in a certain relation or not, because this is an arbitrary social matter and not a biological truth. The biological truth does exist, and we should not be superposing it with superfluous social considerations that only make sense in this specific point in time. Sexual orientation is not an identity, it is not an aesthetic, it cannot be changed, and it cannot be altered. Understanding this will be more helpful than superposing it with artificial and arbitrary genders and types of attraction. This is my opinion. Although my writings be a grain of sand on a beach, an unheard back thought in the osmosis of the mind of society, I hope that, unlike the popular opinion, it has logic enough to withstand the test of time, and perhaps someday in the future, when the popular opinions will have changed a dozen times to arrive to its more final and unchanging form, some will realize that their new considerations on the matters of sexuality are not so, that a desperate attempt for logic existed even in the fluctuating chaos of changing ideologies that were the 2020s. And that a couple of faint voices were arguing for logic in their scream against the wind. 10th of March 2025. Thinking about the matter some more, there's something I should elaborate on, or perhaps simplify. I use the word behavior a lot, but you can just as well say psychological. You can psychologically be of a gender separate to your sex, but expressing that in an aesthetic manner, or implying that genders must be societally considered differently to one another is doing nothing more than enforcing gender roles. I guess I am not saying that transgender people should not express their gender aesthetically. I am saying that you don't have to be of a gender to express the aesthetic that has been tied to it, and transgender exists in a lack of understanding of this. Whether you are a boy or a girl psychologically should have no weight in your place in society, just as whether you're a boy or a girl physically shouldn't. But perhaps something we should start doing is use the words psychological sex instead of gender. In this manner, gender would be of expression, it would be of aesthetics and of social considerations, and psychological sex would be of whether your psychology is that of a male or female, or between the two, under the idea that such things exist, which is strongly debatable. In this manner, I can maintain my opposition to the concept of gender while admitting that a person's psychology can be misfit to their sex, just as their physical body can be. Gender is what we should strive to abolish. It is needless aesthetic to sex and societal considerations to sex that we should not be perpetuating anymore. Our wordings have forced us to conflate the separate concepts of aesthetics and psychology into the single word that is gender, and I think it is time that we dismantle this confusion. Gender is of the social. It is artificial and arbitrary. Psychological sex is of the mind. It is an unchanging biological truth. Though, of course, with this said, we actually should be debating on whether or not there is such a thing as female and male psychology. The social condition taught behavior on its own seems already to be superior to the inherent natural psychology of sex, which makes the searching of what consists this psychology even harder. Perhaps this is a reason why I had been so intent on differentiating transgender from transsexual in my previous writings, as transsexual is the natural truth of the physical body, to which can be added the natural truth of psychology, whereas transgender is of the artificial concepts of gender that enforces gender rules and invariably tie gender to an aesthetic, for in truth, aesthetic and social considerations is all that gender is about. To decide whether or not gender should exist, we should ask ourselves two questions. The first would be the following: do females and males have a different psychology to one another? The answer is yes, and thus by this answer alone we can consider that gender should exist. But let's ask a second question. Should genders be societally considered differently to one another in spite of inherent differences? And the answer here should be no. Thus we can conclude that gender shouldn't exist, or better yet, that we should keep it distinct from psychological sex. Psychological sex is the answer to the first question. It is the true psychological differences between genders, and gender is the answer to the second question. It is a problematic and unjust difference in societal considerations based on physical and or psychological traits. Gender is unjust and it is restraining. The progressive thing to do is not to create more of them, it is to abolish the whole thing. 11th of March 2025. Reading back yesterday's writings, I see that the words I had put in place had parallels with some I was already equipped with. What I called psychological sex and gender are truly just gender and gender expression respectively. I guess it goes to show just how much we conflate these two notions. How unfortunate. Perhaps it is overdue time for me to follow my own advice on backtracking upon opinions and staying detached from them. Time for me to look more critically at the opinions I have been arguing for thus far. Simplified to a single phrase, the opinion has been the following. Gender distinct from sex perpetuates gender rules. For this I have been for the total abolition of gender, and I have remained as such even though through exploration of the topic I have realized the distinction between gender and gender expression, a perspective that thus gives validity to gender separate from expression, as one's psychology can be misfit to their sex. And this dilemma I have explored by asking the question of whether or not there actually is such a thing as male psychology and female psychology. And thus this last would seem to be the determining factor to the dilemmas above it. If male and female psychologies are sufficiently distinct from one another, then gender distinct from expression has validity. And thus concepts such as transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, demi-boy, demi-girl, and the rest have validity. But if male and female psychologies are essentially the same as one another, all of these genders lose their meanings. So thus is the ultimate question. Do females and males have different psychologies to one another? The greatest problem here, the reason why I have now written 50 pages on ponderings about sexuality, is that the ultimate question does not have an ultimate answer. The answer is not completely yes, and it is not completely no. And better yet, if the answer is in fact that females and males have distinct enough psychologies, then arises new questions that we must ask. The main one being the following. Does gender imply that separate genders must be societally considered differently to one another? If yes, why, and is that a good thing? And if no, why, and is that a good thing? An inherent difficulty in understanding these matters is the fact that we currently do consider genders differently. An argument I have been giving for thus far is that genders must not be considered differently to one another, and I have argumented that this meant genders must be abolished completely. As I have stated in page 19, gender only has validity when it is not social, and gender has no function when it is not social. This is an opinion I think I must now re-explore. The proposition was that if gender is given validity by psychology, yet societally genders must still be treated the same, which I believe that they should, then gender would essentially be invisible, a matter of the mind that needs not be shared. I like this perspective, for it settles itself in the alignment of considering different psychologies to females and males, and allows for the existence of gender, while still explaining that it serves no societal function, and is entirely impractical, for gender expression must be kept distinct from gender. But of course here we come across the naive and terrible reality that is the considerations of the popular opinion, since they themselves do not expressly separate gender from gender expression. They do not see gender as something invisible and inconsequential. And so, as I stated in page 39, it fucking is about gender roles. So basically here is the summary. If male and female psychologies are too similar to each other, then gender must be abolished completely. If they have sufficient inherent differences for classification, then gender should be maintained, but should have no weight or impact in social considerations. If it had social implications, then those would be gender rules, arbitrary matters such as the idea that females need to wear dresses and males need to wear pants. Perhaps in other words, I am coming back on my opinion of abolition of gender, because I have been conflating gender and gender expression. But it is hard not to, for the people I'm arguing against, the popular opinion, also conflate gender and gender expression, and believe that gender must be societally consequential, without admitting that this is a reinforcement of gender rules. My logic is that gender should act somewhat like high-functioning autism. I do not need to say to anyone that I am autistic. It can be more or less invisible, and it certainly should not alternate the way that I am treated by my peers. I have been for abolition of gender because I was conflating gender and gender expression, but even though I do not anymore, the popular opinion still does, and so it seems easier to remain for abolition of gender rather than to specify the rules attached to it, for the popular opinion itself is not yet capable of truly making that separation. Here perhaps is the conclusion to where my opinion lies. As long as the popular opinion sees gender as something practical, or in other words, as long as they do not separate gender from gender expression, I will remain for the abolition of gender. And if someday they do make the distinction between gender and gender expression, and see gender as something completely impractical and inconsequential, then that day I will no longer be for the abolition of gender. We are not there yet. In this day and age, distinction between sex and gender exists specifically to be seen in a specific manner. Transgender girls want to be seen as girls, and transgender boys want to be seen as boys. I want to see a person, and I consider that gender is not to be seen. Transgender people do not see gender as impractical and unconsequential. They are perpetuating gender rules, and thus I am forced to this day to remain for the abolition of gender, even though it could be otherwise. 13th of March, 2025. So here I presume are the two questions we are to ask if we are to decide whether or not gender is a concept to be maintained, and neither of which have clear-cut answers. The first is, do females and males have sufficiently distinct psychologies from one another for gender to exist as a classification to them? And if yes, the second question is, does gender imply that they must be societally considered differently to one another, and what are the consequences of the answer? Perhaps my disagreement with the popular opinion lies more so with the second than with the first. One would think that attempts at being progressive would automatically imply giving same societal considerations to both genders, but clearly progressivity is not a singular thing. The large majority of transgender people answer to the first that psychology does dictate gender, and they answer to the second that genders must be societally distinct from one another. They answer so for this last because, likely more so than cisgendered people, they do want their gender to be seen, and thus they must think that it is a social matter. And for this I disagree with the popular opinion, for my belief lies in that gender must not be a social matter, under the assumption that it even exists. It is a dilemma. By accepting gender, we are allowing for concepts such as transgender, gender fluid, demi-boy or girl, and others to exist, but we are implying that genders are to be social and distinct, which is uselessly unegalitarian. And by abolishing gender, we are creating true equality between sexes, but not allowing for transgender to exist. Except here's the thing, the reason why this last approach is so much better than the prior is that it is in fact transgender that we're forbidding and not transsexual. The freedom of what to do with one's body still remains. And better yet, bodily modifications are sufficiently logical to justify that sex has been altered. And it will in fact be a matter of nothing more than sex, for fixing how one feels within their body, and not of how they feel socially, for if we understand both genders the same, this problem would not exist. People who contest for gender and concepts such as transgender are inexorably stating that males and females must be societally considered differently to one another. If they were not, there would be no need for gender to exist. They are fighting on the side of gender division rather than against it. Perhaps there are some people who are for the maintaining of gender while still understanding the distinction between gender and gender expression, under the idea that psychology is gendered, which again is debatable. But they do not appear to be the majority. What transgender people want above anything is to be socially considered according to the constructed traits of gender, not simply understand the specific traits of their psychology. Of course, they only operate this way because the current world we live in is one of clearly divided genders. As I said in page 15, it is the necessary temporary solution. But this only holds true for transgender, not transsexual. It is not necessary, and this point in time absolutely is the time when we should renounce the gender rules. As I said in page 28, why do you feel the need to call yourself a woman to dress and act like one? To this last question, one might reply, because I do not want to just dress like a woman, I want to be a woman. And thus, in fact, by stating this, they would be admitting that genders must be societally distinct from one another. They would be perpetuating gender roles. I'm not convinced that psychology clearly correlates with gender, but even if it does, giving it any form of utilitarian function would be perpetuating gender roles. And so on this I will close. Gender only has validity when it is not social, and gender has no function when it is not social. March 14th, 2025. What is the purpose of gender? This question must be divided into two. Is gender psychological and is gender social? Neither overwrite each other and neither have clear-cut answers. In my opinion, gender should only be maintained as a concept if the answer to the first is yes and the answer to the second no. And as I observe it, the answer to the first is maybe, and the answer to the second, for the majority of people, is yes. Thus, I believe that gender distinct from sex perpetuates gender rules. If gender was distinct from gender expression, it would not be so, and even though I now make that distinction, most in the popular opinion do not. And even if the second question was resolved and we decided to understand gender as societally inconsequential, we would still be left with the first question. And often I fail to believe that psychology correlates sufficiently with gender for this classification to be valid. One of the initial points of me writing down these matters was to try detecting my biases, and thus keep my arguments purely logical. But I have noticed that I have been less and less taking the time to analyze my biases as the writings progressed. Here is a bias that I have just noticed as I was thinking about the matter some more. I had been considering that I was wrong on the matter, that most in the popular opinion conflate gender and gender expression. Perhaps many do understand gender as societally inconsequential, perhaps even most. Yet by considering this, my mind did not automatically accord that this meant gender was valid as a concept. It immediately jumped back to question 1, is psychology sufficient for gender, and started thinking on why it may not be. So from this, I can deduce that on some level I am trying to make a point and defend a single perspective, more than I am actually trying to be objective in the matter. A mental track has been shaped, leading to a conclusion, and the beginning of a new one accidentally converged with this first on its descent. This should not be the goal. Having noticed this, I will spend more time observing my biases and fighting against the natural tendencies of my mind of these shaped tracks, even if many times I will fail. If not most, for thus is the nature of a bias. It is a blind spot of the mind. Let's thus put this tool of self-criticality to the use. It may be that yes may be answer to the first question, and that psychologies do sufficiently correlate with gender, and no to the second, that gender is not social and mustn't perpetuate gender rules despite existing. If these are the answers, then I guess I'm fine with the concept of gender. I do notice that my mind is still fighting back to admit this, for it somewhat disqualifies my now 58 pages of writings on the matter, or at least a part of it. I will be thinking back on this with a clearer mind. For now, what I will say, for it still seems that I am trying to defend this case, is that both questions of psychology and sociality don't truly appear to have concise singular answers, and for this the debate is worthy to be had. Who knows, this might have been the reason why I spent so much time on the topic. Maybe it is that as soon as I was willing to confess that one of the two questions could be answered in favor of maintaining gender, I did not allow the second question to be too, in my desire of defending this opinion, even though both questions of psychology and sociality always could have been answered in favor of gender. I will have to think about this some more. 15th of March, 2025. Of course, with this said, we actually should be asking ourselves whether or not gender correlates with psychology and the way we understand it too. I hold the belief that social conditioning weighs a lot more on the shaping of behavior in psychology than the inherent psychology does. This has existed since before antiquity, this social reinforcement of what is male and what female, and in the 19th century, the social division has grown even more. But although the division is so spread in history and geography, I still believe it to be mostly artificial, an inherited ideology that, although has been useful, we do not need anymore, similarly to religion. And this is because there have been countries and there have been times where this division has not been so strong. In Celtic Ireland, for example, I understand that women had a lot of rights. In our day and age of this 21st century, it is popular culture in the form of movies and other media that are perpetuating in our minds conceptions of masculinity and femininity, especially American movies, with large muscular gun-wielding men and seducing well-dressed women with perfect bodies. It comes to the point where we are starting to forget how artificial and extreme these stereotypes are. In real life, people are not like this. The division between genders in both body and mind is truly a lot more faint. Social conditioning certainly forces men to be masculine and women to be feminine, but if it were not for social conditioning, how masculine and feminine would we truly be? Well, the thing is, we're starting to see this. This is the reason why progressist ideologies are so prevalent. Because we are seeing in ourselves that we are not masculine and feminine, while not understanding that these concepts were fake since the beginning. This is why so many people are choosing specific genders, I believe, because they see that they don't fit with the social concepts of their gender and feel like that makes them different from others. With this new age of mass sharing of any possible thought and opinion thanks to the internet, cultures such as that of femboys are rising, and even straight males can be femboys, as is the case with myself. And this culture has arisen because men never were strong and masculine, and in aesthetics always have been artificial. And now that we finally have the freedom to express ourselves as such, we do. Femboy culture is incredibly progressive, because we are untangling the fictional concepts of masculinity, whereas cultures of gender, such as transgender and gender fluid, are doing nothing more than reinforcing masculinity and femininity. Femboys and tomboys are progressive, as they are no more than aesthetics and full deconstruction of gendered behavior. Transsexual is progressive, as that is of no more than the body. But anything that has to do with a gender is assuming that masculinity and femininity, as we see them in movies, are objective realities, rather than exaggerated constructs. I think that the reality of the matter is the following. Males and females do have psychologies that in some faint way are distinct from one another, but I don't think they're quite distinct enough for the separation of gender and sex to quite make sense. This separation we make because we do not distinguish gender from gender expression. I think that fundamentally behavior is not gendered, and thus any conception of gender inexorably reaffirms that masculinity and femininity exist, because by placing your gender between the two extremes, you're implying that the spectrum exists, and that the extremes are objective. You're implying that this frame of masculinity to femininity exists, and I believe that it does not. Yesterday I have heard that there is such a thing as a femboy flag, as they do with genders. To this too I want to oppose myself to. Femboy is an aesthetic and behavior, like goth and punk. It is not a gender. For this it is more progressive than gender, and I think it better to renounce to a flag to maintain this distinction. This of course is but a detail. In my rereading of today's writings, I noticed I spend the most of my time explaining why men and women must be treated the same and are essentially not that different from one another. If these incredibly fundamental matters of equality are the arguments I am to bring in the debate against gender, then it probably shows just how primal and detrimental gender truly is, despite the popular opinion's belief that they're being progressive by maintaining it. Here is the conclusion on today's writings. Any statement of gender distinct from sex, may it be transgender, demi-boy, demi-girl, gender fluid, non-binary, or anything else, are in fact stating that gendered psychology is binary when it is not. It is presuming a spectrum between behavioral genders that is binary, continuous, and objective, when no such things exist. The spectrum is not two-dimensional, yet any proposition of gender inexorably states that it is. In reality, there is no such thing as objective masculinity and objective femininity, even though both popular culture and social conditioning have falsely taught us that there is. Non-binary has it in the very name. It presumes that gendered psychology is binary, so as soon as we realize that it is not, the term ceases to be logical, and fall with it every other term that are set upon the same two-dimensional plane. Gender fluid says that gender is objective. I say that everyone's gender has always been fluid, because the way we understand gender is completely false. So, to answer the greatest question, what is the purpose of gender? Well, first we must ask if it is social. If it is, then it is needlessly perpetuating gender roles. If it is not, we ask the following question: is it psychological? And the answer is, well, yes, sort of, but it certainly isn't binary, and yet the way we use the word suggests that it is. So here is what I will end this exercise on. I am for the abolition of gender, but a large asterisk must follow the statement to specify that things are incredibly nuanced and fluctuant, and that under certain perspectives gender makes sense. But what I will have to end on still is the fact that on most perspectives, gender does not. Non-binary implies that gender is binary, which it is not. Gender fluid forgets that all gender is fluid. Pansexual means to be attracted regardless of gender, which in other words means in the possibility of being in a same-sex relationship, while not understanding that this technically applies to everyone. Every singular gender implies that gender is binary, and for this, none of them are correct. Perhaps this is the one answer I have been searching for since the beginning, the one explanation I have been searching for the words for all this time, that gender is not binary, and every gender distinct from sex necessarily imply that it is. If so, what a great note to end on. 17th of March, 2025. Learning happens in two phases: documentation and practice, discovering new information and trying to put it to use as to actually understand it properly. These writings are the latter. Even if my documentation is yet to be complete, the putting to practice the information discovered must accompany it on the journey. For this exercise has value, even if I will inevitably come back on a lot of what has been said. Here's a reply to the first video I made archiving these writings and sparking debates, titled Thinking About Sexuality, an Attempt at Nuance. February of 2025. First note, more semantic than argumentative, is that transsexual is an outdated medical term. There are some transgender people who still use the label, however it is considered derogatory by a larger majority of transgender people. It is a little similar to the word transvite, in that it assumes gender, sex, and gender expression are all the same. More importantly, I don't think gender is entirely social or distinct from sex. Obviously, I believe, as a trans girl myself, that there are two distinct terms. Even so, they are correlative, and interact in a way that I think is not addressed when people say that they are completely different. This is because I found gender to be a psychosocial phenomenon, and, unlike gender expression, not purely social. While gender expression completely changes depending on which time period or culture you look at, gender as a concept is always either binary or bimodal. It implies that there is an objective psychological foundation behind the concepts of man and woman, even if the roles those genders take on are constantly shifting. Ultimately, this is my attempt of addressing the problematic nature of gender roles without having to abolish gender entirely. Of course, as I mentioned, I am a transgender person, therefore I want to believe that there is validity being the gender I identify with, as well as having all other biases that come with being a white middle-class American. Hello, thank you so much for the reply. I sort of forgot I had posted this video. I thought about the subject a lot more since then, and I found that my opinion lies more so on that abolition of gender might be the better solution for society on the long term. But this is because I understand gender as being purely social, but I see that you're suggesting it to be phenomenological. I will be thinking about this. Thank you for contributing. "16th of March, 2025. Hello again. If you don't want to reply to this comment, feel free not to. I realize that there's something you said that I have come to disagree with. I think that, unlike what popular culture and social conditioning have taught us, gender actually isn't binary. I don't think there is objective masculinity and objective femininity, yet every gender distinct from sex necessarily implies that there is. They imply a linear spectrum between gender psychology that I think has never actually existed. This is the matter I'm currently pondering about. Don't quite know what to do with this information, or if it even makes sense. 17th of March, 2025. So this is now the next thing for me to explore. If any gender separate to sex exists, it necessarily implies a spectrum of gender, and thus imply objective femininity and masculinity. So here's the question: is there such a thing as objective femininity and objective masculinity? To answer this question, let's do a mental exercise. Let's take every human male and every human female and observe one group from the other. Do they present different characteristics? The answer is yes. Alright, but now let's remove from our two groups two things. Let's remove social conditioning and let's remove hormones. For gender distinct from sex, in fact, desires to be distinct from sex. It wants itself to be unchanging despite which hormone the body possesses. So now, do our males and females have different traits to each other despite not being socially conditioned and despite not having any hormones? Well, this is the great question, isn't it? For if they do, there is such a thing as objective masculinity and objective femininity, and thus gender is valid as a concept. But if they do not, then it cannot. We can only make suppositions on what the answer may be. I tend to believe that in this scenario, the psychology of males and females would be the same as each other. And one of the reasons why I do is because of children. Children do not have hormones, so that problem is resolved, and only is left the matter of social conditioning. And the truth is, boys and girls act the same as each other, and in children where social conditioning is somewhat absent, we observe that they have the same interests and behaviors as each other. Maybe in our two groups, certain psychological characteristics appear more so in one sex than in the other. But is this a sufficient categorization method to suggest that those traits are inherent to them? Both males and females have same psychological traits, but is observing that some traits are amplified in one group sufficient to say that those traits have an automatic correlation with the group? Gender distinct from sex imply a spectrum. May it be binary or trinary, it is a spectrum nonetheless. And thus, for the spectrum to exist at all, there must be on both sides objective masculinity and objective femininity. If there is no such thing as objective masculinity and objective femininity, every one of the 72 genders put in place by the self-proclaimed progressist ideologies fall apart. In fact, it would not just be that they would not have meaning anymore, it would be that they themselves would be responsible for perpetuating gender roles, for attributing to masculinity and femininity differences that don't actually exist. The popular opinion thinks itself progressive, but it is not, for it argues that gender is singular and concise and precise and unchanging and unfluctuant. It says that man and woman are singular things with singular traits, and that those traits do not change. These are gender rules. These are considerations forced upon a sex, despite the fact that the sex will not always withhold the presumed traits. Yet gender as a spectrum, or in other words, gender distinct from sex, will necessarily apply these arbitrary traits to man and woman for the spectrum to be valid. Here we have a large board with all 72 genders suggested by the popular opinion. On the extremities, we have boy and girl, and all the traits presumed belonging to them. But now, if we understand that masculinity and femininity are not objective terms, and are willing to demonstrate the true fluctuant nature of gendered psychology, we pour out of the board boy or girl, and immediately fall with it in a shambling mess of scattered pieces all other 71 genders. For boy and girl were the frame of reference from which they wished to derive. So as soon as we realized that this frame of reference actually was not singular and unfluctuant, the pieces that clung on to this frame, to this spectrum, ceased to be logical at all. You cannot make a singular byproduct out of something that itself was not singular and actually included the byproduct in its vagueness since the beginning. It is funny, actually. We're doing the opposite with a gender than we were doing with autism. We no longer use singular and precise terms such as Asperger's, since psychology is too vague for singular classification and the autism spectrum can be kept large. Whereas with gender, the popular opinion renounces to admit that gender is not singular and have fabricated an artificial frame of genders in this confusion, not even realizing that they're perpetuating gender roles and are doing so, for they are keeping in the notion of masculinity and femininity, traits that should long have been blurred and detached. In our two-group experiment of males and females without hormones or social conditioning, we either would be left with no difference in psychology between the two groups, or some group having more specific traits than others. But if so, are those traits indicator of gender? Well, I suggest that no, or that this is too vague for an argument, for not everyone, and not even the near majority, will be equipped with those traits, and thus it may be correlative with gender while still not being an indicator for it, or even a clear consequence. Because again, here's the conclusion, gender psychology is vague and unfixed, it is not singular, and thus every singular gender set between this makeshift spectrum cannot logically make sense. It fails on the logic perspective, for it falsely presumes that masculinity and femininity are objective, and it fails on the progressive perspective, for it is in fact perpetuating gender roles. Everyone is non-binary, for gender has never been binary. Everyone is gender fluid, for gender has always been fluid. It has never been singular, and saying that it is would be to attach to male and female arbitrary traits, and worse, social traits, that would presume both male and female must be societally considered differently from each other. These are gender roles. These are what we're striving to abolish before gender became something to choose. Every gender distinct from sex imply objectivity and femininity and masculinity. And for this, none of them are correct. 22nd of March, 2025. Femboy and trans girl is the same thing, except that one says the truth about their body and the other doesn't. One dismantles gender roles and the other perpetuates it. One does not correlate aesthetic to sex and the other does. One is not of gender and does not consider masculinity and femininity to be objective. The other is of gender, and the automatic assumption that masculinity and femininity are objective that comes with it, the pretense for their conservative vision to make any sense. Femboys and tomboys are progressive. They are fashions that annihilate gender. Transgender is conservative, in the sense that it associates to sex roles and aesthetics that should long have been detached. 31st of March, 2025. I don't understand transgender because I don't understand why it would have any importance what your gender is. If gender distinct from sex had any sort of social manifestation, those would be gender rules. We should have been beyond that by now. As I stated in the Sex of February, what is the point of categorizing gender if gender roles don't exist anymore? Why would anyone care about their gender? Why would it matter? Gender only has validity when it is not social, and gender has no function when it is not social. If you say you want to be seen like a boy, then you are inexorably stating that boys are to be seen differently than girls. Transgender people will play the martyr and act repressed, even though they are the ones plaguing society with conservative ideologies of gender. You are the ones being conservative here, and you fail to understand it. So with transgender not making sense on the psychological level, since there is no such thing as objective masculinity and objective femininity, and not making sense on the social level, since it is needlessly perpetuating gender roles, we are left with no reason for which transgender should actually exist. 24th of April, 2025. Most people use the word transgender in replacement to transsexual. I do not. I use both words in different manners. I approve of transsexual because it leans against biological reasoning, and I disapprove of transgender because I disapprove of the concept of gender. I'm making sure here to say approve and disapprove instead of saying that I am for or against. These are in fact matters of opinion. It is complicated to separate gender from gender roles. A valid argument for gender is that it superimposes a psychological pattern, and that thus gender can be correlated to this pattern of the mind instead of physiology. But remains that not all males who think and act like females want to be females, and thus it was decided that gender is of choosing. But what does an individual take in consideration to decide upon a gender? They decide upon gender roles. Gender roles is what pushes to transition or not to. The psychological element can still coexist, but it is not the drive. And so here we have a dyslogic triangle that collapses upon itself, a three-step oxymoron. The psychology is the excuse for transition, but individuals may not want to be assigned a new gender, or may want to be assigned to a new gender without the correlating psychology, and thus the choice is formed upon gender rules, social matters fixed to conservative perceptions of gender instead of the psychological element, whom was what the excuse was built upon. The psychology is the argument for gender distinct from sex, but the choosing of gender does not rest upon psychology. It rests upon the idea that males wear pants and females wear dresses, that males must be tough and stoic and females emotional, that males like sports and females like cooking. For the most part, these are social constructs, and very detrimental ones in that. And those who fight for the acceptance of gender distinct from sex inexorably embrace these conservative ideologies instead of going against them. When I say that I disapprove of transgender, I am not being the conservative one. It is those who disagree who are. 26th of April, 2025. There is one final topic that I have not yet touched upon in these writings on atypical sexuality, a matter that I have thought about and nuanced for multiple years before putting any of these thoughts on paper, and that was one of my starting points in my questioning and challenging of the popular understanding of sexuality. This topic is about LGBT plus pride, its intent, its reasoning, its function, its methodology. About 4 years ago, in around 2021, I had started thinking logically about pride and had developed a strong disliking to it. I observed no homophobia in the little world that surrounded me. Because there was none, the homophobia dwelled a bit further. And so I did not understand pride as restoring atypical sexuality to the same level as typical sexuality, but instead using the supposed specter that was homophobia to elevate atypical sexuality higher than typical sexuality. And I have to admit that, to an extent, I still feel and believe this, with a lot more nuance and understanding, of course. But with a title such as Pride, I do find it very difficult not to maintain a distaste for it. I do not approve of pride, lower p. I generally see it as a negative, and even earned pride must be moderated. But I certainly do not believe that pride should be had if not earned. I believe that it must be the result of work and effort. Being proud of something that was not earned, let's say for example the country you are a citizen of, would in this case just be a backwards and subtle way of expressing racism, as I observe it. I do not like pride. The worst people I have ever met in my life were always the proudest. So first we should ask the following question: is pride, capital P, earned or not? Because you can certainly argue that it is, and even more poetically, that fighting to make atypical sexuality something to be proud of is in itself a manifestation to be proud of. It is very beautiful. But then, once atypical sexuality is accepted, and the fight needs not be fought, is there any more merit to the pride? If no one is homophobic, pride does not elevate atypical sexuality to the same ground as typical sexuality, but it elevates it beyond, and the very merit for allowing to do so is no longer present. This is very specifically the arguments I was already giving 4 years ago. I was expressing that pride should exist, but only for a short time, until homophobia was sufficiently reduced, after which pride should no longer be expressed, as it would neither be merited nor be restoring balance, but in fact disrupting balance anew. This is not how the popular opinion conceives of pride. They understand it as something to be perpetuated indefinitely. This I still disapprove of. The matter in which my opinion evolved was that even 4 years ago, I thought of homophobia a thing of the past, and thus that pride was already disrupting equality instead of restoring it. I have since then left my little mountain town and learned a whole lot more of the world, and I can see that in our year of 2025, pride is still usefully restoring a balance. I am not opposed to gay pride, I am opposed to the perpetuation of gay pride. But it is true that to some extent I disapproved of it even without the notion of perpetuation. I understood it as the following. Being proud of being gay was like being proud of being left-handed. Sure, in the Middle Ages and modern era, you might be called a witch or wizard for such a trait, or even in the most extremes, be burned to the stake in times of tension, yet obviously far less than one might think. Homosexuality has always existed and has always been at least vaguely understood. But that is no longer the way the world is. Being proud of being left-handed is just absolutely ridiculous. It serves no function, it restores no equality, it just manifests its difference as a difference even more explicitly. This last point is the reason why all of this came back to mind, and I thought it worthy to write this down. An interesting thought emerged that relit my disapproval towards gay pride. I imagined a public statue in the streets of the city I live in, a statue that portrayed a loving couple, a man and a man. But then I thought of the reception of the statue and the message it was understood to express. Its message should be the simple and pure expression of romantic love. But because of the social climate that has been built up by gay pride, it would instead be understood as a message petitioning for the acceptance of atypical sexuality, petitioning for pride. We would not just see it as a statue about love, such as the ancient Greeks and Romans would have seen no more than love in the homosexual elements in their art and literature. we would see it as a statue trying to elevate the perception of atypical sexuality, because pride inherently fails to normalize LGBT+. It does not want to normalize it, it wants to elevate it. And thus being left-handed is no longer just a normal and understandable trait in nature, it becomes something to be pointed to be glorified, to be proud of. Having worked back through all of these thoughts, I am now rekindling my distrust towards pride. It is exactly as the name suggests. It does not want to normalize this natural phenomena that is homosexuality. It wants to glorify it. This is not equality. There is no pride in being to be had in being left-handed if it's just a random trait you were born with. Of course, I feel obligated to add that the purpose of pride is to make people with atypical sexualities feel comfortable within themselves. This is obviously something we should aim to achieve. But the conclusion I want to leave on is that normalizing an atypical trait is generally better than choosing to be proud of it. It is healthier and it is wiser. Think of autism, for example. The large majority of people in the spectrum are not and do not want to be proud of it. They want it to be socially normalized. They want a normal life. Pride does not normalize. 27th of April, 2025. The two-statue thought experiment truly is a good illustrator. People of the older generations would not think, when seeing a statue of two loving males, here's a statue of the simple pleasure and purity of romantic love. But instead most will think, here's another one of those pride things. So I can say with confidence that pride fails to normalize because we see here that it already actively did fail to normalize. When reading in the Iliad the intense emotions that Achilles feels for Patroclus, when reading in stories of the Argonauts the love between Heracles and Hylas, when seeing ancient or Baroque art of the love from Zeus to Ganymedes, such as in the 475 BC statue from Olympia, or in Rubens' 1638 Rape of Ganymedes, when reading or seeing art of the love between Apollo and Jacinthus, such as in Jean Broc's 1801 neoclassical painting La Mort d'Hyacinthe, when reading probably anything Sappho of Lesbos ever wrote, no one would think of these works of art and literature as being petitions to modify a social dogma. We only understand love, or more so desire in Zeus's case, since that is the only thing to understand here. All of these works succeed in normalizing homosexuality, and they can only do so by renouncing to express pride, because pride expresses the difference as a difference, which inherently makes it impossible to normalize. Even in human eras where homosexuality was condemned by religion, such as in the modern era, people still saw in Rubens and Jean Broc's homoromantic art no more than a perfectly understandable state of love, whereas in any contemporary art, very often we would see in popular homoromantic art an expression of petition for change from one dogma to another. And this very specifically is because of the social climate that gay pride has constructed. It is not just that pride fails to normalize, it is that it already has failed to normalize. It expresses its difference as a difference. And also may I add the meaninglessness of pride for an unchosen trait. You were born left-handed, so what? That doesn't do anything for you, now does it? Of course, every time I express such a mean remark, I feel obligated to nuance it by saying, yes, the point of pride is to make marginalized people feel comfortable within themselves, and yes, it arguably succeeded in doing so. But then here's the thing, right? You can only feel pride if it's a fight. You can only feel pride because of, and thus thanks to, homophobia. This is not a healthy dynamic. If you want to be proud of atypical sexuality, instead of it being normalized, you need people to condemn it for that pride to be earned, or in fact for it to make any sense at all. Pride relies on homophobia. Normalizing does not. Pride relies on homophobia. What an insane phrase to realize to be true. It is very specifically because I disapprove of homophobia that I disapprove of gay pride. I believe that atypical sexuality should be normalized, in a large part because it happens to be normal. It is a recurrent natural trait. What a difficult thing this would be to express to people. I disapprove of pride because I disapprove of homophobia. It sounds oxymoronic, and yet it makes a lot of sense. Pride fails to normalize, and pride only makes sense in the context of homophobia. And thus, here's the choice. You can either be proud of atypical sexuality and approve of homophobia, or you can renounce the pride and present atypical sexuality as normal, and thus disapprove of homophobia. To approve of pride for atypical sexuality is to approve of homophobia, because without homophobia, there would be no fight to be fought. There would be nothing to be proud of. 28th of April, 2025. Of course, the necessary next question is, would have atypical sexualities been more normalized if pride had not existed? And the most likely answer is no, or more specifically, that it would have been a much slower process. I am 24 years old. When I was young, being called gay was considered an insult, and it has been so for every generation before mine, even as far back to the Greeks and Romans, where it wasn't specifically the attraction to other males that was shameful, but specifically having the role of a woman, sexually and above anything socially. Even only 10 years ago, when I was a teenager, there was still a decent amount of homophobia, so if pride is so strong a movement, it is because it was an equal pushback to the rejection of it. So gay pride certainly makes sense, and it makes sense why it exists, and took the shape that it has, but that still does not mean that its method and dogma is ideal. As of now, in the writings of these past 2 days, I have detected 3 flaws in the method of pride. Its failure to truly normalize, its indefinite perpetuation, and its relying on homophobia to be earned and make sense. And there are more that I may add as these ponderings proceed, such as the fact that it may be more so a question of comfort than vital necessity, and that in our Western civilization we fail to understand it as such. That is a complicated and nuanced topic that we might later go into. So let's start with the first flaw. Would atypical sexuality have been more normalized if people had not chosen to be proud of it? I do not know. We can only make guesses. As I have stated, it would have been a much slower process, but at the end of it, atypical sexuality would certainly have been normal instead of special as it now stands. Of course, it is special by the fact that it is atypical, but since it is not chosen and not earned, except if homophobia is to be perpetuated, as I expressed it as a paradox, then having pride for it is grotesque and unwise. I can come back to the ancient and modern art and literature that I have enumerated, and stated that if we only followed the pattern of these, homosexuality would have easily been normalized and understood, that these oeuvres show no pride and yet successfully normalize. But I observe this pride versus normalizing dichotomy not just in the art I analyze, but also in the people that surround me. Let's thus add my personal empirical observation to color this debate. I have observed a very interesting correlation in my entourage. I study in the humanities and social sciences, and the people with atypical sexualities in my life that are not academics have expressed pride, while my many queer friends that study with me in the humanities do not. It seems that the human and social sciences just naturally attract people with atypical sexualities and neurotypes. Among my closest friends, there are 2 autistic girls and 2 bisexual girls, and I myself am autistic and sexually nonconforming. But so here's the correlation I observe. It is we who academically study human behavior that are less prone to engage in pride. One of my gay friends has once remarked against it. And those who do not study academically that engage in pride. This may just be a random correlation, however. The real question lies in what follows. Which one is healthier? My academic friends have fully normalized homosexuality. They see it as neither a positive nor a negative, just a trait that an amount of humans are born with, exactly like autism. They express neither shame nor pride, for there is no reason for either to be felt. And it works. With them, atypical sexuality is normalized, without the need for pride. This I do see as healthier. Of course, the argument can be made that this only is possible thanks to the social climate constructed by pride. And this is likely true, but at least we do not push for the perpetuation of pride. It has served its function, and soon will need no more to exist. And needs be said, my personal empirical observations are only worth so much, and my social circle is only so big. The comparison between atypical sexualities and high-functioning autism is one I have often been brought to make, and it might be interesting to delve deeper into, for their symptoms are on the outside very alike, while their reactions to their situations have been drastically different. They are both psychological characteristics that are invisible from the outside, unseen social struggles that can be perceived just as they can only be understood if discovered and expressed. Except, and of course I say this with inevitable bias, I truly understand high-functioning autism to be a much more complicated matter, since it is not just a social one. It can affect every detail of one's life. But the reactions to the situation is what I want to observe, rather than the situation itself. 4 years ago, when I was developing my distaste for pride and pondering on a comparison to autism, I had the following thoughts. No autistic person would feel or want to feel pride for being autistic, or even want to be autistic at all. They would only want it to be normalized, to be socially understood, to have a somewhat normal life. Pride for it would have not been just too much to ask for, it would have been unnecessary and useless and ridiculous. These thoughts I have nuanced since then, but I certainly still empathize with them. High-functioning autistic people, as I perceived it, and as was probably very true at the time, would not want their difference to be paraded and beloved, but on the exact contrary, to be less seen, to be in better correlation with the social reality, to be normalized. The difference was similar, a psychological uncoordination of the mind to the rest of society, but the desires it sparked in these minorities were the opposites. Those with atypical sexualities wanted to scream aloud their difference, and those with atypical neurotypes wanted their differences to be dimmed, for the true desire, as I have thought it and felt it myself, was truly for the difference to not exist at all. As an autistic person, I felt like I was simply not allowed to be alive. For this I was in depression for 7 years, from age 15 to 22. Pride for my difference would have made absolutely no sense. I desperately wanted it to simply not exist. It is no wonder why I felt such resentment against gay pride. I had heard of other autistic people who expressed the same resentment, and now the logic to it is perfectly clear to me. We both suffered more and demanded less, and still did not receive the simple understanding we demanded. And the ideology of pride was not one that could be applied to us. We understood it as useless and unmerited. There was nothing to be proud of. We just wanted to be allowed to be alive. And so we arrived to this fourth flaw with pride, the fact that fundamentally it is a matter of comfort rather than vital necessity. To live without a partner or to never go through a gender transition is hurtful, but it is not a matter of life or death. Pleasure beyond human necessity is comfort, and in the Western world we continuously forget that. I'm little by little remembering all of the complaints I had about gay pride. Here is one that I suddenly remembered, a flaw that I had spent a lot of time thinking about. The fact that in our society, minorities are only accepted when they are petitioned and manifested for. A few generations ago, it was the fight for women's rights, then the fight for the rights and acceptance of groups of ethnical minorities. And in my generation, it's a fight for the acceptance of atypical sexualities. This is how we function. It is always a fight, a manifestation that happens in loud and in color. And through this method, we have accepted social minorities, one by one, to the rhythm that they fought. But so, what about the social minorities that cannot fight, or do not want to, such as, again, autistic people, or other social minorities that would rather not be proud or express what makes them socially different? This is a terrible method, to accept minorities only when they fight, and if they can fight. This too was a reason for my resentment against gay pride. Wouldn't it be better if we all tried to accept, or at the least understand, every social minority that exists, instead of waiting for them to scream about it? Because some cannot scream. To give an example other than autism, people with Tourette syndrome would also very much not want to be proud of their difference, or to publicly manifest about it, while still desperately wanting it to be socially understood and accepted. The concept of public manifestation for change is just terribly flawed, and I hate that we rely on it and continuously perpetuate this method for change. On every single one of these flaws of gay pride, its failure to normalize, its dependence on homophobia to be earned, its unnecessary perpetuation, the problematic methodology of pushing for change through manifestations, and the fact that it leans more so on the side of comfort than vital necessity, are all topics that I could delve deeper into and write dozens more pages on for each. But I am tired and annoyed, and so this last is the only I will elaborate on. We do not understand the amount of comfort we live in. We truly do not. Fighting for women and non-Caucasian people to have the same amount of rights as white men was an essential. Being allowed to romantically be in a relation with someone you're attracted to, or even to be in a relation at all, is far less essential. It is comfort, and it is very far from being the most important thing to fight for in the world. Thinking that the acceptance for homosexuality in, for example, the Near East is worthy to be fought can only be conceived in a total lack of understanding of the vital essentials that need be fought first, such as very merely giving rights to women or allowing for freedom of faith. In our Western world, we so often forget that other countries do not live in our extravagant comfort, and we fail to readjust our priorities. Let them eat cake, we say, as they starve from lack of bread. Pride is flawed. It has done a lot of good, but it is our duty now to acknowledge its flaws. May 2nd, 2025. Gay pride is strange as a concept. It is of neither critical thinking or of empathy, but of the passing from one dogma to another. 4th of May 2025. Being allowed to be in a relationship with someone one is attracted to, or to even be in a relationship at all, is a matter of comfort, of luxury. It is not a vital necessity. The luxury is worthy of being asked for, because in the Western world we live in luxury, but always we must remember it as a luxury, and that many and many are the fights more important to be fought. 22nd of May 2025. I now want to write about a much more personal matter, my own personal struggle with sexuality that I have been going through these last few years, and especially these last few months. A very minor problem in my life compared to the many others I've experienced, but still now it occupies my mind heavily. It is one of the contexts of my viewpoint, and a strong reason why I always felt well placed to criticize the popular consensus on sexuality. Here is my dilemma. I am heterosexual, but sexually, erotically, I take much more pleasure in having the feminine role. I would take very little pleasure in making love to someone, and 10 times more pleasure having someone make love to me. Tiresias was wise. But it is a problem because I am not inherently attracted to boys. Aesthetically, I feel immense attraction to AMABs who shave face and body, but multiple problems come with this. For one, feminine boys and trans girls are truly rare. For two, feminine boys do strongly lose their femininity after a certain age, some after 30, others at merely 25. The twink death that popular understanding now perceives. And for three, because I am heterosexual, I will never be attracted to boys in a hormonal manner. Their skin texture and body smell will always repulse me. I'm 24, and I am at an unexpected point in my life where every desire I had once had before I had started living has been accomplished. I became a successful art history and archaeology student in university. I made amazing friends that were both nerdy and queer. I became a femboy, doing cross-dressing in private and IPL. I went out with friends, I worked on brilliant projects. All of these long-resting desires that were in the back of my mind when I lived the monotone life of a solitary baker for 5 years, I now have hurled into reality and accomplished. And having been so spoiled, I searched for more desires that were buried, and I found one. Wanting to know what it's like to be in a romantic relationship with a feminine boy. Except, as I had said, boys do not always stay effeminate, and I am already 24. My opportunity to meet such a person is closing, and my search on dating apps is appearing unfruitful. Of course, I must stay aware that intercourse is but a detail in a relationship, and it is unhealthy for it to be my motivator. But the truth is that I don't feel a strong desire to be in a relationship for the everyday moments. I very much enjoy staying alone. And so, in truth, sex has been my motivator, and thus the reason why I have been searching for a boy instead of settling with a girl. I'm aware that this is not a great drive, but it's a curiosity I really wanted to fulfill, and the window in which I could is now closing. I am greatly attracted to my own body, and I wanted to have an experience with someone as pretty as I am, before I myself become older and lose the femininity my body possesses. But no one can I find, and this strange dilemma has installed me a fear I had never had before, the fear of growing older. 26th of May 2025. I think that the United States is actually incredibly dogmatic, and that this is the reason for which the culture of gay pride has grown. It is not enough that homosexuality is a logical natural phenomenon. A dogmatic people do not abide to logic, but to the accepted truth, whether it be true or not. For homosexuality to be accepted, its dogma must be constructed, propagated, and maintained. It is a superstitious and dogmatic country that cares more for what is socially accepted as truth, rather than the indefinite pursuit of reasoning. This explains both why religion is so prevalent in that country, and why homosexuality can only be accepted by becoming part of the social common consensus, even if its logic had stood on its own since the beginning. The United States functions and relies on dogma. It is a shame that in Europe we live under such immense cultural influence to the States, and that pride has grown here also. Hope I would have had that we could have understood and integrated atypical sexualities as a logical phenomenon without creating for them superfluous dogmatic social standings. 29th of May 2025. It is interesting, really. One of the main reasons that has been pushing me to write and measure my thoughts has been the fact that my sibling and I carry drastically different thoughts and understandings on sexuality, in spite of ultimately having the same objective. Our common objective is to eliminate the weight of gender expectation. My sibling is proclaimed gender fluid. They are in favor of gender and consider that the choosing of an appropriate gender relieves of the expectation, and that it adopts a fitful expectation. And as for me, I am a gender nonconforming straight autistic male that rejects the mere concept of gender. Instead of adopting a fitful social expectation, I opt for removing the expectation altogether. Our objective is the same, yet our solutions are diametrically opposed and contradicting to each other. For their philosophy cannot function without the existence of gender, and mine is the very abolition of gender. We are as Catholicism against Protestantism on Christianity, as Plato against Aristotle on philosophy, as Confucius against Xuanzu on Confucianism, as Mondrian against van Disburg on abstract art. We have the same intent, but the roads we follow to meet it contradict each other. I maintain, however, that my road is better, for eliminating gender at its social dogmas takes away the problems at its roots, whereas giving a varying choosing of genders only concerns itself with the outpour of the stream, without admitting that it can be stopped from its source. And the outpour is ever shifting, for gender is fully dependent on the ebbs and flows of culture and social understanding. My solution, to renounce the gender rules instead of perpetuating them, destroys the problems at its source. Transgender is meaningless if genders are indifferentiable to each other except by physiology. Yet also it must be said that we operate on different data, or have different interpretations to the data. My sibling considers that the mind is gendered. I believe that, on one hand, the aspects of the mind that are different in the two sexes are very faint, and that culture and social pressure are the real players, and that, on the other, masculinity and femininity are not objective. I consider them too vague and fluctuant to ever be determining factors to a non-physical gender. Transgender perpetuates gender even though gender is the problem. That was the opinion that I had set out to analyze and nuance and contest. Yet after these 101 pages of analysis, the opinion still has not changed. May 30th of May 2025. It has become increasingly clearer to the popular understanding that people with autism very often borrow atypical labels of sexuality, now that atypical labels of sexuality have been crafted. I maintain what I said earlier, for I believe it to be well put. To be a human male or a human female, one must first be human. And for this, autistic people don't fit in the expected notions of male or female, for they do not pass the first step, that is to contextualize those attributes. This absolutely applies to myself. I am a straight male, yet the majority of my friends are female, 5 out of 6. I do pulse light on body and face, I cross-dress in private, and I don't relate to many activities and passions typically related to males, such as sports. I am revealing here a bias around which my arguments revolve around, and I recognize it as a bias, but I also think of it as a unique viewpoint that can bring new insight and understandings that lack them. Most autistic people identify the oddities of popular consensus on sexuality on themselves, and label themselves as non-binary or gender fluid, for they see that the consensus's logic does not apply on themselves. I, however, propose that the consensus's logic does not even hold on itself, and thus it is the popular consensus on gender, on how they are expected to act, interact, operate in the world, that I am attacking and questioning. I simultaneously believe I am in the right for doing so, while at the same time acknowledging that my bias may withhold me from understanding gender interactions and attributes that actually are inherently natural, without my observing of such. My viewpoint is what I have to contribute, and wishful I am that it may be nuanced by everyone else's. To go back on the opposing discourse of reasoning I have had with my sibling, our own personal genders would have actually been incredibly alike if our ways of understanding them had not been opposites. They identify as gender fluid because they believe in the maintaining of gender, and I absolutely would have identified as non-binary if it was not for my maintaining that gender is abstract and degrading. I maintain that actually everyone is non-binary, according to the current consensus on gender, for gender distinct from sex is not objective, and thus it has never been binary, nor can it form a spectrum. A spectrum can only be built upon clear immobile foundations, which masculinity and femininity are not, for they are not singular or objective. Truly it is that I had started this exercise out of spite. The day before I had written down the first page of this exercise, about 4 months ago, I had playfully and nervously brought up to my sibling inconsistencies in the matters of transgender and the logic it abides to. This short discourse had ended with them telling me that I think too much, to which I replied that they don't think enough. And thus, annoyed and spiteful towards the comment, I had decided in deliberately thinking a whole lot more, and putting down my thoughts to observe what I may have been right and wrong about. I have now written 104 pages over the course of the 4 months, and I am very glad I did. A lot of my opinions became simultaneously clearer and more nuanced. Never will I ever tolerate to be told to think less. Only those who see a threat in logic and critical thinking are the ones who will push for such behavior, and thus it is they that are the ones that we must be the most scrutinous with. Maybe it is that strong parallels may be made between gender and religion. Both rely on dogma, on common consensus, rather than critical thinking, and I have witnessed both push their opposers to stop thinking. And so clear it is now why I felt such passion in criticizing gender. It is the same passion I had felt long before when I was a young child observing the inconsistencies and huge flaws of religious thinking. I will never accept to renounce the critical thinking. Your opinion will have to stand on its logic, never on its dogma. Gender distinct from sex accommodates to gender expectation. Abolition of gender removes gender expectation. I am in favor of gender abolition, and thus I disapprove of gender distinct from sex, whereas my sibling approves of gender distinct from sex, and thus necessarily approves of gender. It is what I call a healthy disagreement. Our end goal is the same. 2nd of June, 2025. I have been rereading my writings of end of April, and I was struck by the Marie Antoinette analogy on the self-proclaimed universal fight for LGBT. Let them eat cake, we say, as they starve from lack of bread. I find it well put. Don't worry, little Timmy, you may be starving in the streets because of the wars, but at least people in the West are working really hard and putting all of their energies in allowing you to be in a same-sex relation. Isn't that neat? You should be glad. Same-sex relations and gender transitions are luxuries. They are worth being asked for in the West because we live in luxury. Other countries do not. 6th of June, 2025. To people who believe in gender distinct from sex, you are taking the variety and nuance of the human mind and subjecting it to your fictional dogmatic conceptions of what masculinity and femininity are supposed to look like. Some males act and think and behave in matters we have socially labeled as feminine. Some females act and think and behave in matters we have socially labeled as masculine. These minorities are part of the sex group. They are ever present and should serve as a reminder that masculine and feminine are subjective concepts, for these sexes include these individuals. Except what is happening now, in our year of 2025, is that these minorities are being taken away from the physical reality they exist in as classification, and are being moved to the subjective concepts of masculine and feminine, a sociological and artificial invention. And thus we're removing the nuance present in the sex group by saying that actually this behavior belongs to the other sex group. Why is no one seeing this? It feels insane, and to them I'm the one not being progressive. What the actual fuck? We are actively perpetuating and actually very much enforcing the concepts of masculinity and femininity without understanding them as subjective. These were no more than a false and arbitrary reflection of psychology patterns, a sociological invention superposed on top of a true physiological truth. Yet now, this fictional sociological error of a tool has become to our eyes a reality, and it is the very people who suffered from gender expectations that are now playing into it and reinforcing expectations of masculinity and femininity, instead of proposing that they were fictional since the beginning, for these minorities were a true and essential component of the sex group. I follow a content creator named Frederick Chen, one of many creators who I admire, who are male, and yet dress in a manner that is considered female, and do makeup, which also has been considered as such. This week they have announced that they're transitioning to being a woman. You went from destroying gender rules and expectations to perpetuating them and reinforcing them. Congratulations, we are all fools. We are perpetuating the idea that this is what a male should look like and behave, and this is what a female should look like and behave. The sex groups will always have a part of them that do not abide to those expectations, yet we are now implying that they do not count. For gender is of behavior, and this is how we have decided that males must behave and females must behave, and thus those minorities are of the group that their behavior correlates with, even though the concept is both incredibly degrading for men and women, on top of being a purely artificial, irrational construct. And I do not agree that psychology justifies gender. Gendered psychology is not as simple as masculine to feminine, for neither of those concepts have roots in reality, and for the diverging minorities are in fact part of the sex group. They are not in opposition to it or an exception, they are a component. There is no such thing as feminine or masculine. Transgender is a hoax. The more we have males transitioning to female and females transitioning to male, the more we insist upon the division. This is the male side, this is the female side. They don't mix. The defining factor used to be the completely arbitrary factor of genitals, but now we have chosen that behavior dictates gender, and thus we are giving flesh to the shallow concepts of how genders should behave. These specters, that in truth are simply gender expectations, roles, divisions, we could have gotten rid of. We are seeing how weighing and suppressing they are. We are at the highest point of progress in humanity, up until now, yet still we fail to deconstruct dogma. Still, 80% of humans on Earth are believers, in spite of science demonstrating the irrationale of superstitious belief. Still, we think that this is what a male should look like and behave, and this is what a female should look like and behave. People who suffer from gender expectations and transition are the very people enforcing it by doing so. It makes me want to cry. And still, I will be called the bad guy for criticizing what we currently, falsely, believe to be progressive. By disapproving of transgender, if one hears not my arguments, it would be easy for them to think that I am on the side of the conservative desires for the world, a stain left by Abrahamic religions and hard to get rid of. Yet the truth is that this is what I am accusing the people pro-transgender of. They are the ones still abiding to conservative religious doctrines that males should look like this and do this, and females must look like this and do this. I am the bad guy because popular understanding has not yet reached my point of reasoning. We are in a transition phase. I can only hope they will one day understand that perpetuating gender is both irrational and incredibly degrading and shackling. There is a channel on YouTube that has been an immense inspiration for me to persevere in this exercise. It is called Theremin Trees. Most of its videos are dedicated to deconstruct the irrational and degrading nature of religious dogma. I have a lot to say on religion, but I am not ideally placed to confront it. I have never been indoctrinated, and my parents are atheists. The producer of the channel had been indoctrinated as a child, and then got out by allowing himself critical thinking. He is very well placed to critically assess and thus dispute religion and share his observations. And if I am less so, there is a topic in which I am very well placed to dispute myself: sexuality. For as I have largely demonstrated, I am nonconforming myself. I feel the weight of gender expectation also, yet unlike transgender people, I have endeavored to fight against it. Humans should not conform to gender expectations. Gender expectations should conform to humans. 7th of June, 2025. If we presume a gender distinct from sex, we presume that it correlates to aesthetic, role, and behavior. Sexes should not be imposed nor forbidden any aesthetic. All aesthetics should belong to both sexes. Sexes should not be imposed a role, that is called sexism. Behavior in psychology is where the argument for gender distinct from sex stands, and against it I will state anew my counterarguments. 1. Behavior is a lot more so the product of culture and social pressure. I would say from observation that only 10% of gendered behavior is genuine. The other 90% are a faked amplification of these 10% in order to conform to pressure and play along with culture. 2. The minorities that strongly disabide these gender expectations are not exceptions to the sex group, but an integral and composing part of it, as well as the majority of the sex group, those who only loosely abide to gender expectation. The sex group as a whole should not be defined by the minority on the other end, those who express the most strongly the attributes we call masculinity and femininity. And finally, 3, masculinity and femininity are not true objective attributes. They are subjective concepts. They have been ever different depending on the cultures through time and geography. They are selected attributes emanated by only a minority of the sex groups and have been irrationally stated to be essential in composing to all in the sex group. Thus, one cannot say that they have been physically misattributed to your sex group if that idea rests on a false presumption of a supposed objectivity in masculinity and femininity, failing to see them for the cultural fabrications that they truly are. Now to come back to another topic, pride. I would like to share and give voice to a comment left on my diffusion of some of these writings on the internet. Love the work so far, some additional ideas. Additionally, pride parades in many cities replaced many of the community parade parties. It is insulting to a population to continuously appeal to one group over the rest, and has always been the feature intrinsic to initiating resentment. In my town, they cut entire community celebrations for Pride celebration. On that point, of which additionally disproves the narrative of normalization, and additionally proves a behavior of antagonism or at minimum favoritism. Pride before a fall. So how far are any group going to watch you fall, or is that entirely the point? Keeping one interest group dependent, yet operate upon the narrative of caring for the single group. How pride may replace other manifestations for improvement in society that may be more important or have less of a start is another problem that I have not much considered. Now for yet another topic, since I seem to be willing to add some closing words to all three of the matters of sexuality in which I disagree with the common consensus: identity, pride, and attraction. Members of the femboy community love to repeat the following idea: liking femboys is gay. To it I respond the following: well, if the person in question is gay, then yes, and if they're heterosexual, then no. I fully disagree with the notion that having attraction for an individual of the same sex is in itself homosexual. Many individuals exude a lot of the traits that others of the same sex find attractive. Even being in a same-sex relationship would not inherently make the individual gay. It cannot change the interior setting of the mind and body. A gay person forced to be in a heterosexual relationship due to their life conditions would still be gay. Why are we unable to apply this logic on the reverse situation? If being gay, or let's even be nuanced and say pansexual, means to be in the possibility of being in a same-sex relationship, even if the individual is not inherently programmed to be attracted to the partner, then by this logic, every single human on Earth is gay/pansexual. We even see the flaw of this reasoning with the ancient Greeks. In antiquity, people did not know that homosexuality and that being exclusively attracted to those of the same sex was a thing, for they knew, better than we do, that every individual could be attracted to one of the same sex if the conditions were right. We gained the common knowledge that homosexuality exists, and have lost the knowledge that it is not necessary to be interested in a same-sex relation. Just like identity and pride, attraction seems to be yet another matter of sexuality on which we rely on dogma instead of reasoning. I wonder why this is. Maybe on any topic one has not spent a lot of time critically assessing, anyone would automatically have to rely on dogma, on the current presumed truth. Or maybe it is because we are in our times asking questions and choosing understandings about sexuality that we never have before. We are in the middle of a busy, unclear transition phase, where we are finally understanding new things, yet have not adapted our capacity for critical thinking on the discoveries, just as it is for our difficulty from departing from religion, in spite of science demonstrating that it has been a hoax. We have found that our ancient conception of sexuality was absurd, yet we are building our new and improved one on its exact same model. We see that masculine and feminine are ridiculous concepts, yet instead of renouncing to them, the gender, we create a frame of dozens of artificial and arbitrary genders, and we separate them from sex. Yet still, we do not separate them from these ancient and useless concepts that are masculinity and femininity, and have taken on the place from physical sex. We have not solved the problem. We have added our numerous additional pieces on the false and arbitrary, unspacious frame, instead of tearing the frame down. This is what gender distinct from sex is. I wish to be free of the frame. Annihilate gender. 10th of June, 2025. 2 months ago, I left a comment on a news video on YouTube presenting the case of a competitive fencer in the female category respectfully yet intentfully declining to fence against a trans girl. The place of transgender people in competitive sport is a large topic that I have not yet indulged in these writings. The comment section for that video was interesting, for everyone seemed to place themselves in the extremes. Most of it was anti-transgender people praising the attitude of the girl who declined the drool. I didn't find any comment critically assessing the logic of the situation, all were just throwing up their unchanging prejudice, whether it be pro or anti-transgender. All seem to rely on their dogmas and preconceived notions, instead of searching for a nuanced understanding, at least for as far as I read. It is an interesting microcosm of our ways of understanding sexuality. I would like to share my own comment, translated to English. 7th of April, 2025. She has or has had testosterone in her body. It is thus just as much cheating as it would be if a girl took testosterone to gain muscles. It is not a matter of gender, it is a matter of the substance that occupies the body. Of course, the next question would be, where is the place of a transsexual woman if she does hormone replacement? She would have a physical disadvantage in the male camp and a physical advantage in the female camp. It is a dilemma. June 10th, 2025. I do not have a single answer to this dilemma, only propositions for what might be best. The point of having female categories in sports is because they are naturally weaker in body than males. It is to allow a space of equal ground in which they are not competing against foes with a natural advantage. Thus, males should not compete in female categories. The why there are no females in male categories escapes me completely. I do not see the logic in that. So, what about AMABs, who have had testosterone that strengthened their muscles but do not anymore due to HRT? Do we measure the amount of testosterone present in their bodies? Do we consider that even if they don't have any anymore, it still affected their muscle development? Do we wait a certain amount of time, maybe years, before the muscles have lost that natural advantage? I do not know. The first solution that comes to my mind would be that all individuals should naturally be placed in the level as high as they can reach, not as low as they can reach. Make trans men play with men, and trans women play with men also, at least until we find a better solution. This is what I propose. June 11th, 2025. Now, of course, now that we have found the best functioning solution, we have to wonder how people will react to it. I propose that in competitive sports, individuals should be placed in the highest rank that their body can reach, not lowest. Thus, trans males should play among males due to having testosterone in their bodies, at least for those who do HRT. And trans females should also play among males due to having passed puberty with testosterone, which positively influenced their muscle mass. The alternate solution of simply measuring testosterone might function also, but this first is best applicable in the large scale. And what if AFAB girls are put among the male camp due to naturally having too high testosterone? It would go back to being unfair. So the question is, how would people react? And the answer is pretty obvious. Trans girl will say it's transphobic. They will say that the situation gives them dysphoria, and that their gender being female, they should play among the females. But this is a concrete physical dilemma, not an arbitrary social one, so your personal emotions on your body and role in society should not interfere with the planned justice of the situation. The social construct that is gender must not overwrite the truth of physical sex, or more specifically hormones, which they are the reasons why sex groups are separated in competitive sports in the first place. It is hormones that are separated, not gender. Gender does not exist. Yet still I can foretell that transgender girls will call it transphobic anyway, in spite of it being the fairest justice we can craft and the most logical solution. It is a microcosm of society's understanding of sexuality. We give more importance to our sociological understandings of gender, the dogmas that comprise its rules, aesthetics, and behaviors, instead of giving importance to the physical truth of the matter, that those two sex groups are not that different from one another, and believing in gender distinct from sex implies objectivity and the concepts of masculine and feminine, which does not actually exist. They take these arbitrary concepts and hurl them into reality by saying, I am feminine, thus I am a woman, or I am masculine, thus I am a man. And thus, instead of destroying gender differences and expectations, they give them flesh. They don't just perpetuate gender roles, they bring them out into reality like they never have before. And the saddest part is that it is those who have suffered from gender expectations that are now increasing it exponentially. We could have put an end to the false concepts of masculine and feminine, but the trans are against us on that one, and so are the conservatives, who do not even see that they share close ideas with the trans whom they claim to fight. To renounce the gender only is left the small group in the between, the femboys and tomboys and others who see the subjectivity in masculinity and femininity. Yet even among them, many are transitioning. I at least will not give up the fight, and maybe in 100 years from now, some will find my writings and wonder why I wrote them, for all that is written will seem to them too obvious to be wrote. It is not enough to perceive the logic, it must be explained, for society does not rely on logic. Whether it be culture, religion, or sexuality, it is not logic that we rely on. It is dogma. Subjectivity of Experience. 18th of June, 2025. 3 days ago, I was visiting the Gallo-Roman Museum, and while I was observing the artifacts that I now have some knowledge of, I was also listening to the discussion of 3 old ladies going through the museum at my same pace. I was first very pleased by what I heard, for they were utterly enthralled by all that they were seeing, complimenting the Romans' strong and delicate work, yet also comparing them to our own times. Their discourse came from a place of love and admiration, but not of knowledge. The most vocal one was saying how strong they must be to move the immense sculptures, unlike us. And at one point she said the following: "When archaeologists in 1,000 years search for what we left behind, what will they find? Phones." She said it laughingly, with complete conviction of our inferiority to the ancients. Phones, the supercomputers we keep in our pockets that can tell us in seconds any question we have on all gathered human knowledge. What will they think of us? It was only later that I realized how ridiculous the comment was. I was first very much appreciating her passion. But now, with 1 year of training in the social sciences, I'm beginning to understand matters of the subjectivity of value, and I realized that she was not functioning on critical analysis, but purely on value judgments. To her, the point of visiting the museum was not to objectively observe the evolution of human creation and culture, but to praise times past in comparison to our supposed lesser times. It is as if, to my mind, as if she mistook the very reason why these kinds of museums exist. Obviously, I cannot blame her. She hasn't been taught, and I barely have been. I may have spent days analyzing the artifacts you are seeing for the first time, but I am still in learning of the methodology of academic thinking. During the beginning of the year, maybe 8 months ago, I had done a presentation on the Huns. I had done it with immense passion, and I was pretty proud of my work. My professor was less so. He seemed disappointed, yet obligated to present tolerance. I think now that it is because I actually made a lot of value judgments over the course of the presentation. I was presenting Ammianus Marcellinus's report of the Huns and comparing it to what we know of them through archaeology. I was saying he was right on this and wrong on that in a pretty systematic and judgmental manner, when the point of a text analysis is more so to extract knowledge from the text than it is to criticize the writer. My professor had showed tolerance towards my value judgments because he knew I was not yet much trained to detect them, so I will do my best to tolerate them in others. As I have said in some other writings, I think that on matters one has not spent a lot of time critically assessing, one has to rely on dogma, on the current presumed truth. Objectivity is difficult, on top of being ultimately somewhat impossible. I do wish that more people were trained in it, instead of it being relegated to academics. For analysis to be critical, it must be detached, and that is inherently something difficult to do. Our animal brains are not programmed to think of the picture without wondering how we fit into it, how it affects our lot, our position, our identity. We have crafted tools that help in objectivity, yet we ourselves have inseparable lens upon our vision. This is why religions say that God or gods have human shapes. It is due to our subjective vision. This is why gender roles exist and gender distinct from sex still operates within the roles. It is due to our subjective vision. The Gallo-Roman Museum presented an objective evolution of human creation, from Celtic to Roman to Christian culture. It did not say that any was better than the other, or better than ours. It is objective data, be it of subjective people. The old ladies were not seeing it as data. They were seeing what place it had in their subjective lens, their accepted truth of the world. And thus I'm forced to believe that they almost always function in this subjectivity, never being able to see data without giving it a moral or cultural judgment, and wondering how it affects their ego-oriented mental construction of the world. We are just animals, and our minds are practical tools. It is completely normal that we function this way. But we also have the capacity to reduce the judgment of data. I would say that it would only be beneficial to reduce our subjectivity, but even that is a value judgment. We are forced to observe the universe through these lenses crafted by the arbitrary state of life on Earth. A cracked fallen tree with a smoking trunk is just that to objective observation, if such a thing can exist. But to the mind of an animal, it indicates something unusual, maybe a storm that threatens our life, and so we must seek shelter. This tool is a part of us. It is the reason why we have survived and evolved. Yet this subjective consciousness is also that with which we try to scientifically understand all things. Buddhism suggests that the subjective mind is layered on top of an objective consciousness, but likely it is that the consciousness itself is inherently subjective, yet still it is our only tool to strive towards objective understanding. 3 years ago, I wrote this strange philosophical phrase regarding this matter. We are the forks that we use to drink soup. What is meant here is that we have not the shape for perfectly assessing neither science nor philosophy, yet still it is the only tool we have, and we must make the best of it, for glimpses of objectivity it gives us in the work. I have been thinking about the matters of value judgment a lot recently. The last time that I saw my sibling, less than 2 weeks ago, 2 topics had emerged through our discussions: communism and pederasty. With I myself knowing very little about communism, she presented her understanding of it to me, bringing it in a somewhat negative light, without letting it bend facts. I shared that communism was a large part of the oppression of Taoism in China, but she was slightly confused to see that I did not have a negative view of communism in spite of this fact, because I don't. Matters can be neither positive nor negative. In fact, that is inherently their true state. Later, I talked about pederasty, a matter I do know more about. It felt as if, as I was explaining what it is and how it took shape, she was continuously trying to discern if my opinion of it was positive or negative, and I showed hints of neither. In her mind, it resembled too much pedophilia for the negative label she placed on it to be nuanced. The fact that 2 males in a pederastic relation could only be a few years apart did not seemingly add nuance, because the fact that one of the 2 members has to be immature, which generally means a minor or a young adult, systematically meant that it was unalterably negative. This solidity of value does have social advantages, but it is entirely non-scientific, by the fact that it is a value judgment, not a cold observation of facts. She was searching for my opinion for whether it was positive or negative, and she found none, because I have none. With time, I had learned to just see it as a fact. Any moral judgment would be a historical distortion on my part. And even compared to our present morality, it still is nuanced enough a matter to not be thrown into the side of bad. Truly, these ideas tie in strongly with some of my resentment towards Christianity. Christianity does not see morality as subjective. It considers that its God has a clear idea of what is right and what is wrong, and this is even more accentuated in Islam. The opinions of he who created the universe by speech can only be objective truths, and so it has trouble accepting the relativity of morality. In Christian thinking, there is such a thing as good and evil. Moral ideas are tied to the very fabric of existence. A difference with Islam is that to many Christians, the Bible can sometimes not be taken to the word, having been through at least one translation and being born from the reports of multiple mortal subjects, though some groups, such as the fundamentalists, disagree. And the Bible's morality does not evolve with human morality. According to it, homosexuality still is on the side of evil. This is the complete opposite of rational scientific reasoning, for scientific reasoning requires value judgments to be diminished as much as possible, and Christianity, with its concepts of good and evil, says that the value judgments themselves are existential truths. Evil is a horrible concept, the idea that something can be judged as negative by the universe itself, without understanding that this judgment comes from our arbitrary animal minds, born from our arbitrary animal conditions, on an arbitrary rock floating through infinite time and infinite space. 22nd of June, 2025. I think that I've come to understand some of the reasoning principles that my sibling adopts that is opposed to mine, and which the popular opinion is largely adopting. They value what an individual identifies as highly than rational evidence. In the matters of gender distinct from sex, it still has the inherently negative effect of perpetuating gender rules and flawed concepts of supposed objectivity in gender. But at least I have found the principle on which the idea claims ground. It doesn't matter if it is negative for all others. If the individual identifies as such, that is to them what matters. They put vague, unclear interior identification higher than any pragmatic evidence. This also explains the very large tolerance that my siblings hold towards religion, which I had failed to understand the reasoning for before now. I would like to analyze and confront this value placed on interior identification, supposedly ever more important than any exterior proof. When trying to reconstruct an event that happened in the past, let's say antiquity or the Middle Ages, historians will have multiple sources, multiple elements will contradict each other. Archaeology will bring some faint amount of information that we can suppose more objective. Historians will emit theories, and historians will disagree with each other. Multiple different explanations of the event will be given, varying in detail, varying in certitude. But the fact that we are not sure what the one objective explanation is does not change the fact that there is one objective explanation. Usually, though not always, The most amount of evidence will point towards what really happened, but room for disagreeing will always have place. I'm sure you can easily place this analogy on all kinds of present dilemmas of faithful supposition against rational observation. An easy one would be religion. My sibling assumes that all beliefs are equal because her value is placed on the interior right of supposition. She places more value on the right to believe than on critical observation, and I do not. You see, it's a very nuanced dilemma, because neither of us are inherently flawed for the method we adopt. But as the analogy presents, the truth is singular. It doesn't matter what you believe, what matters is the evidence. All of our evidence points towards the non-existence of any God, and though the supposition of the existence of gods can be made for total certitude against the theory is not present, it does not change that all of the evidence points against it, which makes it a less rational theory than the one truth the evidence is pointing towards, the non-existence of gods. The suppositions are multiple, but the truth is singular. On matters of gender, my arguments have been that femininity and masculinity are not objective concepts. But I see now that the reason why this argument is meaningless to her is because it doesn't matter if they exist or not in observable reality. They only have to exist in the mind of the person to be valid according to her reasoning. Why is this? Is it identity that they hold in so high value? I can only suppose so. Maybe they should ask themselves why they give such immense importance to identity, and if things would be better if they did not. For gender, it is quite a problematic cycle. Gender expectations are subjective constructs that push individuals to identify on a gender, and identifying on a gender increases or at the least perpetuates gender expectation. My solution is to remove the identifying on a gender part of the equation to break the cycle, but my sibling and the popular consensus she thinks with give such immense importance to identity, whether it be grounded on realistic facts or not, that to them it should not be removed. Therians are the penultimate demonstration of this identity valued higher than factual evidence dilemma. I always come back to thinking that it is because of the luxury we live in the Western world. We only give such immense importance to our identities because they have took center stage in our worlds and worldview as a whole. It makes sense that markers of identity are valued as so much more important in the West than in the East. And among the markers, sexuality is currently the biggest one. It is because the West is focused on the individual and the East on the community. This is the case on every characteristic: politics, religion, culture. China and Russia have been the center stages for communism, and the United States for capitalism. Confucianism in China and Shintoism in Japan work for the cooperation of society, in which they consider the individual to be less important than the whole, defined by it instead of the other way around. While the Abrahamic religions in the West, and more than any Christianity, are extremely individualists, considering that the individual's personal relation with the God Yahweh and the demigod Jesus are the most central elements. Thus, the individual is the focus rather than the whole. This dichotomy can be found even in modern fiction. Superheroes, a Western invention, are as individualistic as you can get, while animes tend to focus on the group being the most important component, as is the case in Naruto or Attack on Titan. And all of Hayao Miyazaki's movies have a heavy communal undertone. So why am I saying all this? Well, because it allows to observe the subjectivity of the focus on individuality and thus on identity. This exists in the West because of the way our society has evolved, but it could have been otherwise, and in the East, it is otherwise. Now that we are exposed to the ways of the West of the world, we can use it to understand that which we failed to see as subjective. Let's teach ourselves to see the world through evidence instead of through what people make of the evidence. 23rd of June, 2025. Facts don't care about your feelings. It's a phrase that English speakers seem to not take seriously and like mocking, the reasoning for which escapes me. I think that a difference in thinking I have with my sibling is the fact that she values people's emotions higher than rationality, and I do not. I consider science to be more important than our individual lives and opinions. I consider that the evidence is more important than what people make of the evidence. She has a humanistic perspective that supposes that science should serve humanity, and I consider that humanity exists to construct science. If we consider that all interpretations, however distant from the most likely truth the evidence points towards, are equally valid, we are allowing irrationality in our equations. The lesser theories should always be allowed, and probably encouraged to be maintained. It is well to consider every perspective, but it is unhelpful to give unlikely theories equal ground to likely theories. Superstition should not have equal ground with science. In academia, we understand this well now, but the rest of society does not. They still suppose that rational thinking should be halted if it hurts an individual's emotions or identity. We should always be allowed to openly criticize superstition. People's frail emotions should not be an obstacle to rational thinking. This is what I believe. You have the right of superstition, an unscientific ideology, but I do not have an obligation to respect it. Rationality should come first. 19th of July, 2025. Debating with my mother is incredibly degrading to my reasoning capacities. She always has total certitude of her presumed knowledge. If I believe in opinion B at 65%, her belief in opinion A will be at 100%, which means that I must either abandon the debate, leaving us both with her singular, likely incorrect opinion, or defend opinion B, but every time that I do so, the debate becomes dichotomic, the nuances get lost. I get cornered into a totalistic view of opinion B that I should have otherwise avoided. I do not yet know how to resolve this. My best temporary solution is to stay away from her, so that I may cultivate my capacity at nuance. The reason why she holds total certitude in all her opinions during a debate is because the goal to her is not to confront ideas, it is to win. She wants to be right even when she does not understand her own arguments. I have witnessed it. I do not want to be like her ever. I must learn to separate ego from knowledge or critical reasoning. 20th of July, 2025. How do I maintain my 65% belief in opinion B when facing someone with a 100% belief in opinion A? If I insist too little, I will never get to illustrate a point, and if I insist too hard, I will lose the nuance I was supposed to maintain. The problem with debating against people who only hold beliefs at 100% is that it makes it hard to maintain one's own nuance against them, and yet we must, or else the debate becomes dichotomic. But you cannot disprove anything to someone who holds belief at 100%. The best solution is clear. It is to not educate them, to leave them in their totalistic semi-ignorance. I must stop debating with my mother. She does not have the capacity for it. 21st of July, 2025. I have reread the last dozens of pages on thinking about sexuality, those that are the best presented, for by that point, my thinking and documentation were getting rich and nuanced. But there is a detail that I have left behind that I want to bring back into this fuller understanding of sexuality. I disapprove of gender distinct from sex, of transgender, because it perpetuates gender roles and believe that behavior and aesthetic must conform to gender, which I am totally opposed to. But more specifically, it is the classification of gender by sociological traits that I disagree with, those traits being behavior and aesthetic. As I have stated long before, I am not inherently opposed to transsexual, in that, unlike transgender, transsexual qualifies itself by physiological traits, which does not in itself perpetuate gender roles. The traits we select for composing the taxonomy are always at least partly arbitrary. It is true that to qualify whether an entity is male or female, one might judge on the combination of traits, chromosomes, hormones, genitals, physiology. Or one might depend a judgment on just one or a few. The classification has a faint part of the arbitrary. This is why I agree with transsexual more than I disagree with it. If we decide that the trait for qualifying the difference can be hormones only, a person doing HRT will be of the sex they have transitioned to. But, to be clear, it is not just because it is more scientific that I agree with transsexual rather than transgender, but specifically because this classification does not take into account behavior or sociology. It does not inherently state that this is how a male should behave and this is how a female should behave, which are statements that transgender does make. Transgender is sexist. It perpetuates and reinforces gender roles. A misuse of transsexual can also do that, but at least this sexism is not the foundation it is built upon. I disagree with classifying gender by behavior correlation. I disagree even more with classifying gender by aesthetic. Obviously, that is just blatant unnecessary gender roles, but behavior is the more subtle one, and thus it is this one that I will explain. It is true that overall, the male and female sex groups have behavior correlations overall distinct from one another. But here is the thing, they are distinct overall. The behavior correlation does not apply to all in the sex group. A large percentage will always have behaviors that correlate closer with that of the other sex group. But what do all in the sex groups have in common, not just overall but in their totality? Chromosomes, hormones, genitals. If we classify by sociology rather than physiology, we are claiming that the behaviors of the minorities belong to the other sex group. This is sexism. We are announcing that they don't belong, and that our overall understanding of the sex group is more important than the subtle reality of it. Behavior correlation is a correlation. It does not systematically apply, but gender distinct from sex implies that it does. Why would we consider that the masculine percentage of males is more intrinsic to the sex group than the feminine percentage of males? This arbitrary and sexist judgment is specifically what transgender implies. Feminine males are males. They're a reminder that masculine and feminine are arbitrary correlations. Transgender is so unprogressive. Gender based on physiology admits that behavior loosely correlates with gender. Gender based on behavior states that it is a component rather than a correlation. It states that this is how males and females must be sociologically perceived. It states that behaviors otherwise present in both sex groups should be component of the one that presents it the most strongly. It takes the sexist and totalistic understanding of gender humans have had throughout history and perpetuates it and brings it out all the more instead of destroying it. Why can't the male sex group also be characterized by the ever-present feminine males that compose it? By believing in gender distinct from sex, you are reinforcing your flawed, incorrect, sexist perception of the sex group instead of getting rid of gender expectation and admitting that this minority exists and is a part of the whole. What does it mean to be a boy? Having a masculine behavior. So boys can't have a feminine behavior? Sure, well, it's the dress in this manner. So girls can't dress masculine and boys can't dress feminine? Sure, well, I just feel like a boy. Help me understand what that means. Maybe a stoicism and not caring for aesthetic? So can boys not be unstoic, and can they not care about aesthetic? I just relate to boys more than to girls. So girls who relate to boys more than to girls are not true girls, even if they want to? There is no good justification for transgender. It is gender roles, sexism, on every point. 23rd of July, 2025. The way I act with my mother makes her think that I have a disproportionately big ego, and the way I act with my friends makes them think that I have a disproportionately small ego. And I don't know which of the two is truer. I wouldn't know how to judge. A problem I have with debating with my mother is that the subtlety and nuance of the opinions I present seem to always be lost on her. Here are two cases I have analyzed where she has stripped my viewpoints from their nuance. 4 weeks ago, we debated about the religion that is voodoo. I had been reading about it for only a week and stated that according to what knowledge I had yet accumulated, I was guessing that voodoo dolls were a popular deformation. She understood that as my penultimate opinion on the matter and set to contest it. A few days after, we debated about feminism, and I stated that my life's viewpoint did not make me observe any sexism in the world around me. She understood that as my penultimate opinion on the matter and set to contest it. In both these cases, the opinions I presented, whether correct or wrong, were faithful results of data I had accumulated and my understanding of it. I had made sure to precise as such, formulating my understandings based on which level I was educated on the matter. Those subtleties went over her head every time. I have come to believe that she has trouble scaling her beliefs accordingly to her documentation of the matters. On some topics where I was very educated and certain of my knowledge, she still contested with the same level she presents all of her opinions. And the problem, I observe, is that she thinks others do the same. She strips away my subtlety and thinks my opinions are as totalistic as hers. An incorrect opinion, faithfully based off of true data yet incomplete, is a valid opinion. It is fine to be wrong if it is for good reasons. When learning about a new subject, you will be wrong about much of it for long, as you learn. The important part is to scale the opinion to the level of knowledge as to attribute the level of certainty you must give it. It is this that my mother does too little, and worse, always assumes that I do not. Her opinions are totalistic, and she fails to notice when mine are not. 26th of July, 2025. I love indie games of the 2010s. Along with Greek antiquity, they are my current biggest passions. There's something so peculiar in how Michael Afton is portrayed in recent FNAF art. He is handsome and horrific at the same time, literally purple with a decaying body, for he is haunting his own corpse, yet so composed and alive in soul, reflective, melancholic, at peace. It is such a powerful mix of contradicting attributes. His eyes are so often at the same time spirit-like and so human. A particular piece of him that I love shows his cheeks decomposing and teeth showing on both sides, but his lips intact and his face handsome and composed and still very emotive. What comes off of this character is one that has much suffered, been through so much that he died through it and literally decomposed, only to then, with the passing of time and the change of circumstances, slowly find peace and healing. Except the whole point is that deep wounds can never be closed. You can only choose to be at peace with them. I relate to this so much. When I was depressed, I saw myself in my mind's eye as a horrifying decaying corpse. The image that came was that of Meaty during her metamorphosis, as her flesh peeled off and her eyes bulged out. And in the years that followed, although the emotion was never that intense, it was so because I felt like I had already died, and I was just very slowly decomposing, body and soul. But then the unexpected happened. Circumstances changed. Life became simple. I had much time for reflection. Through baking and hiking and meditating and reading and cultivating hobbies, I found stability in my mind and realized that I was alive, and worse, chose to say so. But the wounds were still there. Nothing could erase them. What happened was that I discovered how to be at peace with them. This is why I love fan art of Michael Afton so much. It is the same emotion that the 2020 indie game Omori was all about. As the credits song Good Morning said so well, though the pain remains and though it may be hard, I'll carry on. Je suis horrifié à l'idée que j'aurais pu passer ma vie sans savoir que les gens que j'ai rencontrés ces dernières années existaient. Après avoir passé 8 ans sans amis, j'ai finalement rencontré des gens que j'apprécie. J'ai rencontré des gens, et une fille plus que tout autre, qui comme moi fonctionnent par logique plutôt que par dogme. Les humains fonctionnent plus par dogme que par logique. C'est naturel. C'est comme ça que nous avons évolué. La logique arbitraire interne de la tribu est plus importante pour nous que la logique externe de la réalité. Voilà pourquoi, entre autres, le genre distinct du sexe est un concept auquel beaucoup accordent de l'importance, alors qu'il est fondé sur une idéologie fictive et arbitraire d'un supposé comportement inhéremment masculin et féminin, alors que ces comportements ne s'appliquent pas à tous dans le groupe du sexe. Donc une idéologie sexiste de la nature, car elle perpétue le rôle du genre. Et ce plutôt que la réelle logique externe, celle qui est suffisamment nuancée pour accorder que la corrélation comportementale du sexe est en effet une corrélation et non un composant. Je fonctionne par logique plutôt que par dogme, et pour cela je fus très seul pendant très longtemps. J'aurais pu passer toute ma vie sans savoir que ces gens que j'aime de tout cœur, qui connaissent et raisonnent avec les méthodes de la pensée critique, existent. Classifying gender by sociological traits, behavior and aesthetic, instead of physical traits, chromosomes, hormones, genitals, states that the behavior is more important. It states that gender is not just a random attribute that should, if we were to not be sexist, not have any sociological impact, but one that does. Classifying gender by behavior says that the behavior is more important, and that they must be seen differently to one another. This is gender rules. Classifying by physiology in itself does none of this. Gender distinct from sex presumes an objective masculinity and an objective femininity that does not actually exist, and it presumes this for their deviating sexualities to have a reference point, thus making any gender distinct from sex inherently sexist. Being a feminine man or a masculine woman doesn't make you less of a man or a woman, because feminine and masculine are made-up constructs. They are not real by the simple fact that they don't apply to all in the sex group, only a part of it. Gender distinct from sex states that actually they are inherent to the sex group. This is gender rules. This is sexism. You are not progressive. To be a boy is not to have a certain behavior, it is to have a certain genital. To claim otherwise is to participate in gender rules. If the behavior dictates the gender instead of the genital, that is gender rules. Being a boy does not inherently mean having a behavior psychology that girls cannot have. Claiming so is to comply with gender rules. It is neither logical nor progressive. You have failed on every point. 3rd of August, 2025. Why would the masculine percentage of males be more intrinsic to the sex group than the feminine percentage of males? Gender distinct from sex inexorably states that it is. Les théories sont multiples mais la vérité est singulière. Les théories qui sont, selon les probabilités, plus proches de la vérité, valent plus que les théories qui sont, selon les probabilités, plus éloignées de la vérité. Pas toutes les théories ne se valent. It may be a bit late to state this after having been so open to it for so long, but I see clearly why I should disapprove of transsexual as well as of transgender. That is, in the idea that making bodily changes is of a sufficient argument to say that gender has been altered. And I'm coming back to this for 2 reasons. One, because it isn't. The clearest indicator for gender will always be chromosomes. and we are not yet capable of changing those. When we will be, I will gladly revisit this opinion. And 2, because people don't care about the non-social, physiological reasonings. They only care about gender for the rules attached to them. I stated that transsexual is not inherently sexist, that it does not inherently perpetuate gender roles, but that certainly is how it's going to be used by every single person using this logic to say that their sex has been altered. In the world beyond gender roles that we should be striving towards, it shouldn't matter if one is female or male, so best let the criteria for judging which is which be none other than chromosomes, for those do seem like the fairest indicator. Gender distinct from sex perpetuates gender roles. Prove me wrong. It is neither logical nor progressive. You have failed on every point. 4th of August, 2025. Now that I have finally come to a close to this exercise, after 52 entries, 153 pages, and 7 months of writing, I must establish the mentality that I should leave on. I must not part with open frustration. I must part on a sustainable mentality, for I cannot improve the situation, so I must make peace with it. The mentality I will adopt is the same I must have with racist people and believers. I respect you as a person, but I do not respect your racist opinions, and I forgive you for having them, for you are the result of circumstance. And I forgive you for not knowing that you are a racist, for that is sometimes the case. I respect you as a person, but I do not respect your belief and its immorality. Following a list of rules is obedience, not morality. Doing good and desire for heaven and purpose, and in fear of hell, is selfishness, not morality. And I forgive you for having them, for you are the result of circumstance. And I forgive you for not knowing that you are immoral, for that is usually the case. I respect you as a person, but I do not respect your sexist beliefs, and I forgive you for having them, for you are the result of circumstance, and I do not blame you for not knowing that you are sexist. I must be better than them. Just like believers, they believe that they are the good guys. They believe that they are moral, and that those who disagree are immoral. It is difficult, but we must forgive them. They are the result of circumstance, as we all are. We must be better than them. You are allowed to be sexist. I love you anyway. Je pense que car je suis autiste, je suis moins enclin à réfléchir selon les arbitraires processus de réflexion dogmatique sociétale, et en conséquence plus enclin à réfléchir selon une logique externe aux dogmes sociétaux, et donc généralement plus logique pour cela. Les faits résultent à ce que les autistes haut fonctionnants peuvent avoir l'air surprenamment intelligents, mais la vérité est le simple fait qu'ils ne sont pas contraignés par les mêmes obligations ou habitudes de raisonnement traditionnel. th of August, 2025. Je cherche à comprendre pourquoi mon frère accorde plus d'importance à ce que les gens pensent être la vérité, plutôt que à ce qui est probablement la vérité. Et je reviens toujours à penser que c'est car il accorde énormément de valeur à l'identité, plus même qu'à la logique. If I'm wrong about something, I want to be explained so. If the probabilities point as to my opinion being wrong, I want to be explained so. I want to understand so internally. I want my opinions to be detached from my identity, so that I may change them whenever the need. If you give more importance to identity rather than critical reasoning, you are putting sticks in the wheels of your mind. You are allowing to get so attached and intertwined with an opinion that you will never allow yourself to nuance it. You have become the opinion instead of the presentator of it. Page 8. I'm very glad that I am putting down these thoughts on paper. I find that when one keeps one's thoughts in their mind, they become their opinions instead of the presentator of them. You tend to more easily lose track of the lines of reasonings you followed and become the opinion, have more difficulty in seeing the flaws in the mental tracks you followed. But if those tracks are written down, you can retrace your steps at any point and find bumps on the roads, or entire deviations that you had initially missed. I must be better than them and always allow myself to change my opinion. I must hold the opinion, but never be the opinion. Page 131 and 132. I think I've come to understand some of the reasoning principles that my sibling adopts. They value what an individual identifies as highly than rational evidence. It doesn't matter if it is negative for all others. If the individual identifies as such, that is to them what matters. Page 134. Why is this? Is it identity that they hold in so high value? I can only suppose so. Maybe they should ask themselves why they give such immense importance to identity, and if things would be better if they did not. Page 136. Let's teach ourselves to see the world through the evidence, instead of through what people make of the evidence. On another topic, I have been rereading the first 50 pages of Thinking About Sexuality, and there is an opinion that I want to go back on. It is about dysphoria. I stated that dysphoria should play no part in justifying transgender, because gender is of the mind and of social matters. I don't agree with this anymore. because I understand that the argument is that dysphoria is an indicator that an individual's sex is misfit. This argument I grant, and I believe that I was wrong about. The part of the equation that I disagree with is the idea that there is such a thing as an objectively masculine behavior and an objectively feminine behavior, that the people in the sex group who don't abide to these somehow don't count. This is what is sexist. This and the fact that trans people truly do care about gender roles, and gender roles is what pushes them to state that their gender is distinct from sex. The reason why I put the date on these entries is because I want to be allowed to go back on them. I believed it when I wrote it. It was based on faithful data and understanding, but both of those evolved since then, and thus my opinion shifted with it. I am no stranger to physical dysphoria. I feel it myself with body hair and facial hair. This is why I do intense pulsed light. But I do disagree with social dysphoria, because your gender should not be a factor in how you are treated in society. You do not need to be a woman to dress and act like one. Implying so is bringing gender roles into reality. Another thing I want to go back on, that I have stated much more recently, is that transsexual isn't enough to say that sex has been changed. I find it logical enough to say that it is, but it was good to explore the opposite opinion. As long as gender is based on physiological traits instead of social traits, it is not inherently sexist as I perceive it. What I petition for is for the categorization to not be based on sociological dogmas of male and female that will necessarily comply with gender rules. I'll let the biology people tell me if yes or no bodily modifications can justify an altered categorization of sex. That is not my specialty. What I'm concerned with are the humanities and social sciences. Social matters is where I have a voice. Of course, you are allowed to disagree with any of this, just as I am allowed to explain my opinion over the course of over 150 pages. As a French person, I give immense importance to freedom of speech and expression and freedom of opinion. And so, to my understanding, you are absolutely allowed to think that gender roles should exist, even if I do not. You are allowed to be sexist. I love you anyway. Why would the masculine percentage of males be more intrinsic to the sex group than the feminine percentage of males? Why would the feminine percentage of females be more intrinsic to the sex group than the masculine percentage of females? The way in which you are categorizing gender is based off of the ideals of sexist dogmas. With love, an angry femboy. 9th of August 2025. Quelques commentaires en vrac que j'ai composés cette année et que je veux préserver avec cet exercice. April of 2025. Elle a ou a eu de la testostérone dans son corps. C'est donc techniquement autant de la triche que si une femme avait pris de la testostérone pour se muscler. Ce n'est pas une question de genre, c'est une question de la substance qui occupe le corps. Bien sûr, la prochaine question serait quelle est la place d'une femme transgenre si elle fait du remplacement d'hormones? Elle aura un désavantage physique dans le camp des hommes et la possibilité d'un avantage physique dans le camp des femmes. C'est un dilemme. 2nd of July 2025. If this helps, being straight does not mean not being in the possibility of being attracted to one of the same sex, and same thing other way around. Straight males are attracted to femboys. 14th of July 2025. My reply got deleted twice while replying to you, I presume by the channel moderators. My reply was that following the will of Yahweh means obeying to rules, instead of practicing actual morality. Rules such as kill the gays on sight, Leviticus 20:13, or kill sex workers on sight. You are not a moral person for being a believer. I will not change my comment until it conforms to what you think your belief is. This is what is actually written in your cult book. Following the will of Yahweh makes you a blind murderer that must obey and suppress empathy, and desire for afterlife and purpose, and in fear of eternal torture. A non-believer does not rely on any of those things. They are true good people. You cannot be a good Christian and also a good person. 27th of June 2025. Les observations empiriques, ou disons plutôt concrètes, sont en effet la seule manière d'affirmer une supposition, et elles sont sujettes aux biais, aux déformations des sens et de l'esprit. Mais ne pas reposer une supposition sur des preuves observables reviendrait à dire que tout est possible du moment que l'on s'en convainc. Or, la faute est possible, il faut donc s'en remettre à l'observable, autrement nous nous engagerons dans l'incorrect sans être capables de l'identifier. 9th of August 2025. This last was a partaking in a debate upon the amazing French channel on critical thinking, Hygiène Mentale, a channel which I love and highly recommend. 10th of August 2025. Quelques-unes des immoralités inhérentes des religions abrahamiques. L'obéissance aveugle, les lois haineuses, la foi pour soi, le pardon gratuit, la dichotomie et la fausse objectivité, l'élitisme. Some of the inherent immoralities of Abrahamic religions. 1. Blind obedience. One must not question the rules given by the thing that created the universe by speech. But following rules is obedience, not morality. It does not require thinking, and it does not require compassion or empathy. The Nazis were obedient. 2. Hateful laws. The rules that Abrahamic believers must obey are in fact hateful, such as kill the gays. The laws relish in the violence of punishment. Their blood will fall upon them. 3. Faith for self. An Abrahamic believer is pushed by the most basic animalistic drives, desire and fear. Desire for heaven and purpose, and fear for hell. It is for his own salvation that he is told to do good. An atheist does good for the sake of the world. They are true good people. You cannot be a good person and a good Abrahamic believer. 4. Free forgiveness. A Christian is forgiven of any of his sins as long as he confesses. He does not need to be a good person. He needs to be part of the group. The most immoral person in the world can be forgiven and will be granted heaven. The most altruistic person, if they are not baptized, will burn in the lake of fire for eternity. Your God chose this. 5. Dichotomy and the idea of objective morality. Morality is not objective. It must be the result of thought and empathy. It is nuanced and complicated. Whereas Abrahamic religions, with their lists of black and white rules and their understanding of the absurd concepts of good and evil, say that both are objective. And worse, these too are based off of primal animalistic impulses. For beauty is associated with good, and ugliness with evil. You are not putting in question your biased animalistic instincts and subconscious. 6. Elitism. It is not about being good, it is about being part of the group. The baptized go to heaven, and the unbaptized are burned for eternity. There is no purgatory in the Bible, only hell. Saying that all those who are not part of the group are to be tortured eternally is the most intense form of elitism one could imagine. Abrahamic religions are inherently immoral. Believers often argue, how could there be something out of nothing? But the idea of a God doesn't resolve this question, for the God came out of nothing. So the question remains the exact same. How could there be a fully functioning world out of nothing to how could there be a fully functioning mind and entity out of nothing? When seeing a sublime landscape that brings me to tears, for truly I have before cried to the beauty of a landscape, I tell myself, there can be no God. Humans are so irrelevant to the sublimity I am experiencing. To place upon it a human-shaped God, or simply a consciousness, is to try to see myself in the landscape, when it is so much more and so much bigger than I. Placing a consciousness on the universe is doing a disservice to it. You are trying to understand it through yourself, when it is so much more. I argue that the lack of a consciousness makes the universe even more sublime. No atheist wants to be an atheist. Remember that. No one wants to stop existing after death. That is the single most horrible thing you can possibly imagine, and anyone would be willing to do anything and believe anything to stop that. When I learned of the philosophies behind abstract art, such as that of Mondrian, Van Doesburg, Kandinsky, and Malevich, I slowly developed an immense love for it. The idea is that this is the only art to be truly objective, for it doesn't represent anything of the world of nature nor of humans. It is true objectivity, for it relies on nothing that has existed. It understands that the human mind and its wants and beliefs, as well as the totality of nature itself, are completely arbitrary. Why be attached to this version of existence if existence could also have been anything else? Just as I feel no need for a higher being to cry at the landscape, for I do not need to see myself in it, abstract art sees no need to represent the arbitrary current state of existence to portray beauty or creation. Why would the masculine percentage of males be more intrinsic to the sex group than the feminine percentage of males? Let's teach ourselves to see the world through evidence instead of through what people make of the evidence. Humans should not conform to gender expectations. Gender expectations should conform to humans. De dire que le comportement féminin est la chose qui fait qu'une personne est une femme revient à dire qu'un garçon ne peut pas avoir de comportement féminin ou qu'il ne compte pas vraiment dans le groupe du genre. Si on catégorise le genre par le comportement et l'esthétique, on dit forcément que tel comportement et telle esthétique appartient inhéremment à tel genre, plutôt que de le permettre d'eux. You're saying that actually, this behavior and aesthetic belongs to the other sex group, instead of fighting for it to and understanding it to belong to yours. Categorizing by behavior, role, and aesthetic necessarily states that these belong to or are inherent to the group that you are categorizing it with, and this is in opposition to categorizing by physical attributes, in which way we may observe and allow that the behavior, role, and aesthetic can be present in and belong to both sex groups. You are categorizing gender on gender roles themselves. No matter how you put it, that is sexist. You are saying that this behavior belongs to this group when it can be expressed by members of both. If gender roles is the way in which we categorize, then we will never be rid of gender roles. Tu as le droit d'être sexiste, mais crois-moi, tu l'es. We should fight for all behaviors and aesthetics to belong to both sexes. You are doing the exact opposite of this. You are stating that this psychology inherently belongs to this sex, when it does not, for members of both sexes can have that psychology. You are basing the categorization of man and woman off of what you think a man and woman should look like and behave like. Your whole opinion is built around gender rules and unnuanced ideologies of sexist dogmas. And of course, every one of the 72 genders of the popular opinion, including gender fluid and non-binary, are just as much based off of gender rules, for they wish to derive off of an idea of objective masculinity and objective femininity, whom does not exist. They imply that there is a male behavior that females cannot have, and a female behavior that males cannot have. They are exactly as unprogressive as transgender. Instead of categorizing gender based off of behavior slash psychology, let's allow all behaviors slash psychologies to all sexes. Au lieu de catégoriser le genre avec pour base le comportement, ne serait-il pas mieux de permettre tout comportement aux deux sexes, plutôt que de dire que l'un appartient à l'un et l'autre à l'autre, plutôt que de dire que l'un est objectivement féminin et l'autre masculin? Let's stop with gender rules, please. They are the result of circumstance, as we all are. You're allowed to be sexist. I love you anyway. 11th of August, 2025. By saying that you're a woman because you have this psychology, you're saying that it doesn't belong in the male sex group. This behavior exists in the male sex group, so the choice is ours. To be progressive and allow it in there, or to be unprogressive and lean on what we think stands as masculine and what we think stands as feminine, and categorize gender by behavior. The entire concept of transgender is built upon foundation and pillars of gender rules. Something that I like about this exercise is that I have always successfully scaled my level of affirmity to my level of understanding of the subject. I became more affirming only to the progress at which I was becoming more informed, at which my data and thinking on a matter were getting richer. In the beginning, I was using terms such as, I disagree with this more than I agree with it. I was staying vague and open, and now that I feel like a lot of evidence is on my side, and I have learned to understand it, I allow myself in being more expressive about it. This is good. Let's be better than Dunning-Kruger suggests that we are. Let's be progressive and fight for all psychologies to be allowed to both sexes, instead of perpetuating the idea that this is how a man should act like, think, dress, and behave, and this is how a woman should act like, think, dress, and behave. It fails on the logic perspective. You're saying that your behavior and aesthetic does not belong to your sex group when it can, and it fails on the progressive perspective. Instead of fighting to allow your behavior and aesthetic to exist in your sex group, you're stating that it is intrinsic to and must belong to the other. You have let the dogma of gender rules dictate your reality. Let's be progressive and allow all psychology slash behaviors to both sexes, instead of unscaled of what we think is feminine and masculine. Of course, if gender roles is what you want, then my arguments mean nothing. I see gender roles as inherently sexist, but I can understand why others would think otherwise. I think we can now agree that gender distinct from sex strengthens gender roles. It is because I am against gender roles that I disapprove of transgender. But I see clearly that if you want gender roles to exist in society, then there would be no reason to get rid of gender distinct from sex. And that is an opinion that I find perfectly logical. Damn, I guess it went back to being a matter of opinion. Except the opinion now is, are you okay with gender roles or not? Because I am not, I disagree with gender distinct from sex, and because you are, you agree with it. Both of these opposite opinions have merit. Except, of course, mine is more progressive and understands that being a male doesn't necessarily imply having a masculine psychology, and vice versa. I guess it just goes back to the phrase I kept going back to. You are allowed to be sexist. Le genre distinct du sexe dit « ce comportement n'appartient pas à ce genre, alors j'appartiens à l'autre ». Et cela plutôt que de permettre aux membres de ce genre de pouvoir exprimer ce comportement. Ne vous dites pas progressif, vous ne l'êtes pas. Of course, I'm not a dick. I'm always going to call people by their preferred pronouns, as you might have noticed that I do. But I am going to understand you as fundamentally sexist every time that I do so. They are the result of circumstance, as we all are. Let us respect their imperfect beliefs, and let us be better than them. You have a psychology that social conditioning tells you does not belong to your sex. Yet instead of telling social conditioning that it is wrong and allowing others with this psychology to exist and express themselves in your sex, you are conforming to it and perpetuating its dogma, despite you yourself being the proof of it being wrong. 12th of August, 2025. I'm going to be real. The only reason why I worked so hard on this topic is because of one single petty discourse. It's about that one time I had tried to explain to my brother what I didn't understand about and found illogical about transgender. I had done so nicely and openly, but the way he responded was closed and superior. He considered that he was objectively right and that I was objectively wrong. He told me that I thought too much. He was so convinced that if I thought any of this even slightly, I would just be immoral and unprogressive. I was not allowed to even wonder. I did all of this out of pity. Things are more nuanced than you think. You're not objectively right, and I do not accept to stop thinking and stop trying to understand. Only those who see a threat in thinking will push to stop doing so, and it is they that we must be the most scrutinous with. He was implying that I could not understand because I was not trans. I'm not a Christian either, and it is because I am not that I can tell you what doesn't make sense about it. You do not feel things that I cannot feel or understand things that I cannot understand, unless it be specific types of physical dysphoria, which, as I have said, can be solved and should have no social implication. I am subject to gender expectation also, yet unlike yourself, I have endeavored to fight against it, to tell it why it is wrong and degrading. You are just complying to it. And because of that, you are saying that it is not just a social truth, but a psychological one, and are saying that this psychology should not belong to girls. You yourself are the proof of that being wrong, that gender roles got it wrong, and you go along with it instead of telling it that it was wrong. Bah si, c'est sexiste. Si tu dis que tu as une psychologie de garçon, tu dis que les filles ne peuvent pas avoir cette psychologie, qu'elles ne peuvent pas aussi appartenir à leur sexe. Ça, c'est sexiste. Tu dis que c'est une psychologie objectivement masculine plutôt que d'admettre que masculin et féminin sont arbitraires et de la permettre d'exister chez les filles comme chez les garçons. You have let social conditioning dictate your reality. Do not blame me for not doing the same. Trans girls are literally the most attractive people in the world. It's too bad that they must also be sexist. A girl with a penis and a slightly masculine physiology, that's like the most perfect thing I could possibly imagine. I have set out to find and contest my biases, but trust me when I say that transphobia is a bias that I do not have. This exercise does not serve me, but I must think critically, even when it goes against my desires and emotions. The last generation is unprogressive to the point of being illogical, and my generation is progressive to the point of being illogical. We are in a transition phase, where the new ideologies must be extreme in nature to break the momentum of the old ideologies, before we will, hopefully in the near future, reach a homeostasis whose ground between the two has more of a logic. Similarly, perhaps to how Dadaism had to be extreme to finish fully deconstructing academic painting, and thus would make no sense in its past or future times. The passage from a society with gender rules to a society without them must have this transition phase, where the people who don't abide to the gender expectations manifest yet still comply with them, before the time will come for those expectations to be broken down.